Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The ground under my sleeping pad started to hum before anything else did. I woke because the vibration was insistent enough to move my elbow in the tent. It wasn't the soft, regular weight of a passing truck on the distant forest road. This was thin and steady, like a bass note pressed into earth. I lay there for a second, thinking it was a rainstorm or my imagination, then unzipped the flap and peered out. The treetops were leaning the same way. Not a breeze, not a gust, not that random rustle you get when a squirrel runs along a branch. Every crown on the ridge across the creek angled in the same direction and held. The leaves didn't shimmer. They held that tilt like someone had tilted the whole forest to one side. My headlamp beam skimmed the pine needles and they didn't move except to reflect the light back. Above them, a long, pale glow was sliding across the sky. It wasn't a dot or a flash. It was a soft, stretched light, maybe the shape of a canoe if a canoe were blown up and lit from inside. It moved slow, in one clean glide without edges, more a suggestion of something than a form. Silent. No rumble, no wing wash, nothing. The reflection of it made the creek look like it was breathing white under the dark. The ground under my pad vibrated in time with that light, a faint pulse through the soil that sounded like a far-off train if you put your ear to the rail. My name's Nate. I'd hiked up into the Laurel Hollow area for 2 nights by myself. No signal, no one at the parking lot, the sort of trip you take to get a clean head. I'd set the tent on a small bench near a tributary because it was flat and I liked the sound of the water. I knew the route. Creek, switchback, the ridge, then down to where the old logging road flattened. I'd locked the car, walked in at dusk, saw 1 or 2 other headlamps far off on a different spur. Nothing out of the ordinary until a dozen small things that are easy to ignore stacked in a row and made a pattern. Before I set up, there had been the deer. I cut across a meadow and 5 of them froze in the brush like cutouts. Not running, not startled, just statues with their heads turned the same direction. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds while my heart did that slow thud thing, and then one blinked and they melted into the trees, and that was that. I chalked it up to the way deer are. Then there was the headlamp I passed on the way in. I heard the rustle at the shelter ridge, and the beam swung once and died like someone had dropped their batteries. I called out and got nothing back. Later that night, I walked by the same spot and the lamp was gone. No footprint, no drop pack, nothing. When I reached camp, I found my small compass lying in the tent vestibule with the needle dancing like a drunk. Not a slow wobble, full spins 10 degrees back, then another snap. I'd had that compass since college. It wasn't fragile. I blamed it on the magnet in the stove lid, but the stove was in the bag and the bag had been zipped when I left. It calmed eventually, but I remembered it because it felt like the world was making small exceptions to its own rules. The stream that night was louder than I expected, but sound was doing weird things everywhere. Some of the owls were quiet, and the frogs stopped altogether at 11 when I looked at my watch. I assumed a cold front had moved in. The clouds had been thick earlier, broken now into a dark river of sky, low like someone had folded the heavens. The weather app on my phone didn't load. I didn't expect it to, but the barometer on my little handheld read steady, which made the sudden silence all the more notable. The glow kept sliding. It moved just outside the tree line, following the ridge. It didn't blink, it didn't sharpen, just flowed like a slow tide. The breath in my chest kept catching because everything else that normally says, "this is fine," the leaves, the insects, the damn creek, had become an audience frozen in a theater. I unzipped the tent all the way and crawled out in my socks. The dirt underfoot was cool, and when I crouched down, I could feel the vibration clearer. It wasn't like a single thump. It was a steady, double-tap pulse that ran along the root lines and made the grass hum. My phone screen stayed black when I tapped it. No camera, no map, nothing. No bars, which is normal up there, but it felt wrong to be so cut off with something like that overhead. I made a stupid decision. I grabbed the little binoculars from the pack. Up close, the glow didn't show structure. You couldn't tell if it was something big far away or something thin and close. The edges were soft, and it moved as if it were being pulled on a string with a gardener's patience. When I held the lenses steady, my breath fogged the glass, and for a second, a smear of my own breathing covered half the view, and I saw nothing but the smear, and then the glow was gone, swallowed by the night. The treetops dropped back, and the undergrowth started making their normal sounds, a cautious return like fingers unclenching. That loss, both the suddenness of the vanishing and the way my watch seemed to read a time that didn't match what I remembered, was what stayed with me most. I checked the watch because I always do. It read 1:04 a.m. I blinked and thought, no, I'd sat up earlier at midnight for a second, had looked at it, and it said 12:46. When I checked again, my watch slid calmly to 1:05, as if nothing odd had happened. Time felt elastic in that moment, like a rubber band pulled then let go. I didn't start hiking out until first light, partly because I wanted daylight to make me braver, and partly because I thought maybe I'd dreamt it. The route down felt normal at first. The creek, the rooty switchbacks, the blazes on the oaks, but the forest kept giving me small signs that something had been there. My trail marker tape, bright orange, was gone from a spot I'd tied one to for later sighting, and in its place the bark had a narrow scratch like a fingernail across a ledger. I found another marker a quarter-mile on, lodged in the crotch of a sapling, folded around like someone had retied it and left. No footprints, no trash, just those odd, precise little rearrangements. I met one other person coming up as I was heading out, an older woman with a day pack and a dog. She waved and said good morning like we do in places where people know each other's faces. "You camping?" she asked. I'll tell you how I answered. I shrugged and said yeah. Just a quick overnight. She didn't press. Later, she told a story to whoever would listen about lights she'd seen years ago and how animals react, and I thought about stopping her to ask if she'd noticed anything the night before, but I didn't. There's a way people tell certain things. They look at you with the expectation you'll nod, and then they move on. Maybe she'd seen this once and filed it under anomalies. The descent back to the car took longer than it should have. Somewhere on the old logging bridge, I had to stop because both my knees felt like they'd been pinged by a bolt of cold. The air tasted different, like it had been filtered, and my chest kept fluttering in a way that made me check my pulse a stupid number of times. The radio in the parking lot, the one on my friend's truck that I used to check the weather, was static when I flicked it on. I sat for a few minutes just watching for other cars. By the time I drove out of the forest and onto the paved county road, it was nearly noon. The sun had burned off the low cloud in bands, and the sky looked ordinary. I remember glancing at the tree line from the car window, and the pines looked smaller somehow, as if the night had inflated them, then deflated them. I texted my sister when I hit a signal island up on the highway, told her I was coming home a day early. Her reply was what you expect. Good, bring coffee. I almost called her and said, don't go into the Laurel Hollow if you can avoid it. But I didn't. How do you put the words together without sounding like a half-formed thing? Driving home, the funny aftermath set in, a kind of alert curiosity that kept me aware of every passing shadow and streetlight. At a gas station, I checked the footage on a dash cam, and there was nothing but my truck, the timestamp, and then a short blank white frame that appeared at the exact period when the glow had passed. The clerk shrugged when I asked, said his camera sometimes hiccuped. He didn't spend the kind of money to look for the hiccup. I didn't push. That night, in my apartment, I lay awake until 2 a.m., lights off, listening for the hum that had once run under me. There was nothing but the building's machinery, the elevator, a pipe clanging occasionally when someone above took a shower. The planets were clear in the window. I thought about going back the next weekend with someone, a friend who knows how to handle the dark, but the idea of the routine of a second trip felt wrong, as if by replaying it I'd break something sealed. I told two friends about it in the week after, one that I go hiking with a lot and one who's obsessed with weather anomalies. They both had soft ways of deflecting. Maybe it was lenticular clouds. Maybe you were really tired. The weather friend said the treetops could look like that with certain microbursts, and the watch could be a glitch. I didn't say the binoculars showed nothing when the glass fogged. I didn't say the vibration was like a note under the ground. I left out how the river looked when that light's reflection passed, like something had smoothed its skin and then gone. Weeks pass, and you tuck things away. You unpack the moment, fold it into your usual narrative like a stray receipt in a wallet. But the habit stuck. I look up at the sky more than I used to. Sometimes at the edge of night, I will stand on my balcony and watch cloud banks crawl and wait, stupidly, as if I've trained my eye to a cue. Most of the time, there's nothing but light pollution and the drone of traffic. I went back to Laurel Hollow last month during the day, walked the ridge, checked the trees. The orange marker tapes I'd hung were where I'd left them. The old logging bridge had a new plank. Someone had been there. The scratch on the bark is still there, thin and pale, like a scar on a hand. I run my thumb over it and it feels ordinary, just healed wood. No one I spoke with had at that moment seen anything odd. They'd heard the usual stories about lights over the county, not one specific recollection, just a sense that the place carriers old events. So that's it. I went up for a night, something odd crawled the sky, and the forest behaved like an audience that forgot how to breathe. I came home. I sleep in a bed that doesn't hum under it. I make coffee in the morning and drive to work and pay attention to small things that used to drift by me. I don't have a tidy explanation. I don't have footage anyone reliable would accept. I have the memory of treetops leaning together and a pale, long light sliding silent across clouds while the ground under my tent pulsed like a bass note. That memory lives with the rest of the things you try to shrug off but find yourself checking for anyway, the way something that shouldn't happen did, and how everything resumed as if some rule had been paused and then resumed, leaving a space in your day where it had been. We'd been laughing about something dumb. Eli had just dropped his lantern and it rolled into a tide pool, and Marco was narrating the slow-motion rescue like it was an epic, when the water did the thing that made everyone go quiet. My name's Hannah. We drove down from the city for a long weekend, 5 of us. Me, Jenna, Marco, Eli, and Sarah. We picked the cove because it was one of those places no one checks, a narrow ribbon of sand between a headland and a blackened reef. An old state park that closes off after dusk. We set up camp in the high sand, a couple of tents, a cooler, speakers low, the smell of charcoal and seaweed. It was late July, warm, the sort of heat that makes the air sit on your skin. The tide had been doing its normal thing all afternoon, coming in, then going back, until sundown when it seemed to hesitate a beat, and then retreat more than any of us expected. At first, I thought someone had spooked the seals. Out on the flats, a line of gulls had flown up and then banked hard like a string pulled taut, heading toward the far shore. Their cries were sharp and quick, not the lazy calls you hear when they're bored. Marco said, maybe an otter. And Eli laughed until his laugh died because the gulls didn't go back. Instead, they circled higher and then disappeared into the evening like they'd been called. We weren't alone in noticing small wrong things that night. The radio in my truck, old thing, FM only, had gone dead the minute the sun sank. Not crackle, not fade, just a flat silence. Marco fiddled with it, tapping the dash, flipping knobs. When it came back an hour later, it landed on a weather band playing a man talking about a storm 3 counties over and then cut off again. Phones were spotty. Jenna's kept saying no service even though she'd been checking messages earlier in the day. Anyway, we built the fire and told stories. There was a low hum under the surf, normal when the swell lines up against the reef, but then the hum took a low, insistent tone that felt wrong. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure that hung against your chest. I noticed everyone leaning a little forward, as if waiting. The beach felt smaller, like the headland had moved a little closer. Eli walked the wet sand on a dare, stamping the shells like he owned them. He came back holding a small starfish under his flashlight, face lit like a kid with a prize. He said the water felt cold like a fridge around his ankles, though the air was hot. We all shrugged that off. Salt and river runoff can make ridiculous temperature differences, and went back to swatting mosquitoes and drinking warm beer. A couple of hours later, Sarah's flashlight beam flicked out. Not the LED flicker you can fix with new batteries, but a definite and stubborn fade. She swapped it with mine. I clicked on the spare, and it gave a thin, ghostly glow, hardly enough to read by, like someone had turned the dimmer down on normal. We joked about apocalypse batteries until Jenna went quiet and pointed. The water had pulled back. I'd walked the beach plenty of times and knew where the line should sit at low tide. Halfway to the rocks, a smear of glistening sand with the occasional tide pool. That night, the uncovered sand stretched out like a runway, black and wet and lined with every sort of shell and wrack, kelp, eelgrass, a scattering of crabs left with their bellies up. The exposed reef looked sudden and wrong, like a floor being pulled from under a room. In the distance, a fishing boat we'd seen earlier that afternoon was sitting upright, hull touching mud, engines silent. We all went forward at a cautious trot, the 5 of us forming a loose file. The sound changed as we reached the edge. The surf had gone thin, more of a sigh than a roll, and the rhythm of the waves had stretched longer, like someone slowing a video. It's hard to explain until you're trying to put your hand through it and the motion resists. I felt the sand shift under my boots in a way that made me think of someone pulling a rug. Then we saw the light. It was out on the exposed sand, maybe the size of a car or smaller, dim, not an outright glare. Think of a fog light sliding just above the surface, but cooler, with a pale blue not quite like anything in our headlamps. It hovered maybe a foot or two above the sand, and its reflection, if you can call that dark pool a mirror, was a trembling smear that stuttered with each little ripple the breeze could manage. The light didn't roll with the tide, it hung in place. Eli stopped dead and said, "That's not a headlamp." He sounded like a man who'd caught himself saying something he shouldn't. Sarah had her phone out, aiming to capture it, but before she could hit record, the screen went black. Jenna's hands were shaking. She kept saying, "Look at the crabs," like she needed to point at anything to ground herself. We walked toward it slowly. There was an odd hush with the sound. The gulls were silent, not circling anymore, just gone. No waves chattering on the sand. The world had this soft edge where normal noise would be. Even the fire behind us felt anticlimactic. You could hear it, but it was like someone turned the volume down on reality to see if we noticed. When we were about 100 feet away, the sand under my boots was still wet but firm. The dim light didn't get brighter, it just stayed. Marco, who's got a kind of practical calm and has been kayaking since he was a kid, said, almost under his breath, "It's not a buoy." We all took that as a small point of sanity. We were naming the things that it wasn't, which helped for a minute. A crab scuttled near the glow and then froze, antennae out like little question marks. It didn't die. It just stopped, as if whatever had been animating it was paused. Then the water came back. It wasn't a slow creep. The ocean rolled in like a curtain being snapped shut. 1 second we had a horizon line stretching out forever. The next, the tide was slapping at the exposed reef, climbing over ridges in a way that looked faster than any ebb usually moves. The light winked at the exact instant the first black water hit the flat and was gone. There was no sound to mark the vanishing, just a gap where the glowing thing had been, and our phones scrambling to find bars. The boat that had been grounded slowly lifted, as if someone had put it back on a plinth. Crabs scrambled for the water like people chasing a running bus. The gulls came back in a scatter, calling as if nothing had happened. The air pressure seemed to change. My ears popped as if coming down out of a plane, and the low hum we'd felt earlier eased like fingers off a drum. For a good 10 minutes, we all stood there with the water washing our shoes and the tide pulling our pant legs darker, saying variations of, "Did you see that?" and "What was that?" None of us had answers. Jenna kept looping the same thought. It pulled back too far. It wasn't normal. Eli kept rubbing his arms and said, "My watch jumped forward." He smiled weirdly when he said it, like a bad joke. He checked the cheap digital watch on his wrist, and it read 1:22 when he swore it had said 1:07 a few minutes before. My phone had the same gap when I checked later. The timestamp on a photo I'd taken of the exposed reef said 1:05, but when I compared it to Eli's watch and the file info, the math didn't line up. We all laughed weakly, then, because what else do you laugh about in moments you can't explain? We packed up faster than any of us planned to. The fire was smoldering, and the coals hissed in a small, normal sound. Nobody wanted to leave the beach, not that night. Camping is supposed to be slow. But the air felt thin, and the jokes dried like old bread. We took turns watching the horizon as if the light might return. It didn't. The cove looked the same as it ever did. Black, wet sand, water moving up and down, stars catching in pools. But something in how the night had rearranged itself was sticky. It didn't want to let go of our thoughts. On the drive back over the causeway, phones found something of a signal and a flood of texts came through. People asking about power outages half a town away. A neighbor's tree had fallen on the road earlier that night, and then the call about seals in the inlet. And a vague police alert about a marine anomaly that listed nothing more. We compared what we had, the faint light, the pulled back tide, the time skips. Everyone in the car had a different detail. Marco swore the smashed shells were all clustered like someone placed them. Sarah said the boat had no one on board when it sat on the mud. Jenna insisted the barnacle beds looked cleanly scraped. Little things that might be imagination or might be notes a mind writes because it is making a map of a place it can't understand. We got home at dawn, the city lights like yawning eyes. I slept a little. I checked the news later and found a Twitter thread from a local fisherman who said the tide had run back further than memory, and a police update that called the evening unusual but had no footage to go with it. People threw out words like sensor error and current anomaly. They were trying to make it ordinary. In the weeks since, I keep thinking about the light. Not bright like a UFO in the movies, not a flash of engines or a mechanical shape, just a dim, patient presence over stripped sand. I think about the way an entire beach went quiet, how the ocean answered whatever pinged the world and then restored itself as if nothing had happened. I think about our watches and cameras not lining up, about how we like to keep track of time and how sometimes it slips. I don't have a tidy ending. We came home. We told our friends. The tide returned to its old schedule the next day, and the park ranger who runs the area shrugged and said the coastal sensors had shown a pressure drop and then normal readings. The boat was towed in the morning. No one's gear left aboard. Life moved back into ordinary grooves. Work, bills, coffee. But often, when I hear a gull at dawn or a distant motorboat, I feel that tiny hollow where something else had been. I don't know that I want an answer. I only know that the ocean could do something I have no name for, and for one late night stretch of black sand, the world folded open and let something strange look in. I pulled into the cul-de-sac with a load of boxes still in the back and my scanner buzzing the route for the last stop. It was late November and a wet fog had been hanging all evening, making the streetlights halo like old coins. I'd been making the evening runs for 3 months now. Insulin kits, a pizza place, some habit of the month boxes for the same handful of people, and this small, tidy circle of houses was always the end of my night. Maybe 7 cars were parked, driveways empty. I killed the engine to avoid waking anyone and grabbed the cart. The fog felt close enough to touch, the kind that beads on your jacket and makes your glasses smear. I stepped off the curb and the first little wrong thing happened. The dog in the crane's yard, the one that barks at my truck every time I back in, stopped mid-growl. It didn't trail off. It cut out like someone turned a switch. Silence ate the sound the second the cart wheels hit the asphalt. I told myself it was a coincidence. Dogs do that. But the porch light at the cranes blinked once right then, and the Johnsons across the circle blinked in the same beat. I kept walking, a box under each arm, and watched the pattern play out. Porch lights on every house in the cul-de-sac. Crane, Johnson, Rivera, the small one with the crooked railing, flickering as if they were all tied to the same timer, and some hand was pawing at the knob. My scanner gave a little chirp. I felt my pocket and then went soft. I hit the power button and the screen came back, but the map had jumped forward by 5 street names and then reset. GPS sometimes shivered on me when the fog gets heavy, so I tamped it down as a tech glitch, pushed the cart and rang the first door. Mrs. Rivera answered with her robe wrapped tight. She squinted at me like she does whenever I come in with a package and say, "Evening." I handed over the box and she tucked it in like she always does. The porch light behind her blinked twice in rhythm with the others. She didn't notice. I didn't want to bring up the blinking. You get a lot of looks in this job. I moved to the next house, the little wrong things stacked up. The street lamp near the circle that usually hums had a clean, brittle note when I touched the metal post, and the metal felt warmer than it should in damp air, like a radiator instead of a light pole. My phone, which usually has at least a bar here, registered no service for a stretch. I clicked the home button, checked the time. The dash clock in the van said 9:43. My watch, the cheap digital kind I keep under my sleeve, read 9:43 too. Everything lined up right there. When I was 3 doors from the end, I stopped because all the porch lights pitched into a single small rhythm, off, on, off, like a message in a slow code. The motion was so coordinated it looked choreographed, as if a single hand were skimming them all. I swear I felt the hair on my neck lift, and I'm not a superstitious guy. I just feel patterns, and then I notice them. There was a faint glow that had been collecting in the sky, a seam of light against the low cloud deck, and at first I thought it was the sodium glow from the highway bending weirdly through the fog. Then it moved. Not fast. It slid behind the clouds like the underside of something luminescent was gliding along a hidden track. It kept a wrong kind of silence. No motors, no whoosh, no leaves to give it away. The fog above the cul-de-sac seemed to thin where it passed, like someone had brushed a finger and left a smudge. I looked up and the small group of porch lights blinked in the same rhythm as before, but now they seemed to be answering that slow, sliding glow. The hair on my arms prickled. I reached for my phone again. The screen stuttered, and then a little triangle in the corner flashed, no bars, then steadied. I fumbled the device. When I swiped to the camera, the screen froze for a second with a greenish smear. Then it worked. I pointed it at the seam, and the phone took a picture that showed only an even smear of grain and light. Pixels. Nothing I could hand anyone and say, "Look." I turned my head back to the houses, because the blinking had a cadence that felt like it would resolve if you watched. Houses are lamps and shades and people's routines. They were supposed to be ordinary. I expected to see movement outside a window, a neighbor pulling a curtain, a porch light that didn't want to cooperate. Instead, the lights were steady. No more rhythm. They sat normal, bulbs humming their steady glow as if some time had passed where the whole cul-de-sac had been paused, and then, snap, returned. That snap did something to me. It dropped a note of absurd relief into my chest. I shouldered the box and pushed towards the last house like a man on autopilot, the fog clinging to my collar. The driveway was wet, and my boots left prints that filled with bead-like water. At the door, the bell chimed thin, and Mrs. Crane's voice called out for me to leave it on the step. I set the box down, and she came out carrying a towel to wipe her hands. She smiled and thanked me like any night. I walked back to the van, muscles loose as cloth. On the way, another small wrong thing happened. The wind died entirely. That might not sound like much until you live in a place where the wind keeps the low fog moving. It fell away so complete that a loose tarp on a neighbor's trash can stopped flapping mid-ripple. Sound pooled. The world folded into a narrow pocket of quiet that made the pavement seem too loud. My own footsteps sounded like someone miming them out. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, idling, not wanting to look up and risk seeing the seam again. I wanted the instruments to lie. The scanner chirped back to life on the third try, and the map snapped to my route like nothing had happened. I told myself to load the cart back in, finish the route, be done, get home. Rational talk to anchor a moment that had gone sideways. I drove off the circle slow, lights on low, fog whitening the edges of the headlights, and I kept checking the rear view. I never saw the seam again. The sky looked like the normal, heavy cloud cover of late fall. The porch lights stayed steady as I passed. My watch read 9:57 when I rolled through the stop sign. My phone pinged a late text from dispatch a minute later, asking why I was running 17 minutes behind. At home, I unloaded the van, stacked the empty boxes, and boiled water. Habit sends a lot of men to the kettle after an odd night. The kettle clicked and went through its usual motions. I kept glancing at the window and upstairs at the clock, testing time like a wound. The kettle sang. The wall clock ticked steady. The world reassembled itself into the shape I trusted. All night, I kept checking the street outside with breeds of vigilance I didn't recognize. I lay awake longer than I should have and listened. The fog thinned toward morning. My phone finally caught a bar and filled with texts asking if anyone else had routers glitch, whether our neighborhood had been in the news, if I'd seen any unusual lights. I answered with half sentences. Work was the next day, and the morning felt ordinary in a way that felt false. The route had new trash bags at the end of each driveway like a normal week. Mrs. Rivera waved when I passed the house with her dog trotting at her heel, tail sweeping like it had done for years. I mentioned the blinking to Marco at the depot like I do with small anomalies, the broken scanner, the weird dog behavior, and he gave his typical shrug and said, "Probably a power hiccup. Lines are old around there." But the seam had moved. It had left its mark in the way the lights had answered and in the small scrapes of time that didn't add up in my head. When I passed that cul-de-sac again the following week, the same neat circle of houses looked exactly the way circles of houses always looked. Kids left a bike on the curb, and some teenager had scrawled something on the mailbox with a Sharpie. The fog was absent that day, the sky cut clean. I've told a couple of friends and they nod and make jokes about downtown drones and holiday light installers. I haven't posted pictures. The ones I did take are nothing but grain and cheap smear. The scanner log had a gap that tech couldn't explain cleanly. Just a footnote. Signal loss. Dispatch chalked it up to weather interference and moved on. I don't know if I would be telling you this if the dog hadn't quit barking or if every porch light hadn't answered in time. Maybe it would have sat in the file of odd single things you forget. But the way it pulled at a pattern, sound stopping, lights answering, the seam sliding, made me notice how thin the membrane is between the normal and whatever sits just past it. I went home that night. I made the tea. I stacked the empty boxes in the garage. I did all the things that tell a body everything is still as it was. Sometimes, if I get out late now and the fog's right, I slow my van at the end of that cul-de-sac and sit for a minute. The street is quiet and the porch lights are steady. The fog will sometimes crease the clouds toward the west, and I find myself reflexively scanning the seam between streetlight and cloud just to see if what slid there will drift again. It hasn't. The world keeps its shape. I keep my watch set to the van's dash clock. The dog still barks sometimes, but it looks at the sky a little longer than it used to, and that is enough to make me look up too. I was on the balcony having a cigarette because it was one of those nights my apartment felt too small with the TV off. The city was soft, distant horns, an ambulance wafting by 2 blocks away, half the streetlights humming like old refrigerators. I'd been watching the office tower across from mine for a while, the big glass one on 7th and H that lights up like a mini skyline. People work there in shifts. You get used to the slow pulse of lights moving up and down its face as cleaning crews and late programmers go home. Little things had been off all evening, though I didn't really register them at first. The elevator in my building stuck between floors for 20 minutes earlier, and the neighbor knocked on the shaft door forgetting where he was. He swore it was a tech problem. Carlos, the super, came out later with a flashlight and some shrugging. The bodega on the corner played the same 2 songs on loop for an hour and then went completely silent for 10 minutes. My phone gave me a brazen no service alert 3 separate times, and when I finally got signal, there were half a dozen texts asking if anyone else's clocks had jumped. I figured some transformer had a hiccup. City living has a lot of hiccups. The tower across the street had this company logo up near the top, neon, white. It's supposed to go dim after midnight. Tonight it was on, the letters bright, and when I watched them, the light hummed a little like the rest of the city lights do. I took the smoke slow and listened to the building's rhythm. There was the distant mechanical thrum of HVAC from a few blocks over, a pigeon somewhere claiming a ledge, Mrs. Patel downstairs calling her son on speaker, and laughing in a way that made me feel less alone. Then, the glow appeared. It wasn't a dot like a plane or a blip like a helicopter's landing lights. It was a white, almost surgical light that hung just over the top floors of the tower, not above or around, like someone had parked a bright lamp right above the building roof. It moved very slowly, less than what I think of as movement in the air, more like a wash that slid along the edge of the clouds. The first thing I noticed was how clean it looked against the night, a compact oval of light with a soft edge, not blasting, just there. The neon logo dimmed a fraction under it as if the glow stole some of its attention. I told myself it was a maintenance lift or something. Working at height with a spotlight to patch a sign, people do that at weird hours. I called my friend Jenna, who works nights at the hospital, said, "You up?" And she replied with a sleepy, "Yeah." And then, because she knows me, "You see anything weird?" I told her about the glow, and she laughed, said maybe someone's got a drone. But her laughter had a hollow cut to it, and she asked a detail I hadn't thought of. "Does it make noise?" I strained my ears. Nothing. Not a mechanical whine, not a rotor chop, just the city's bass line and the soft scrape of my cigarette between my fingers. A minute later, the glow flickered. It was a tiny shuddering at first, like someone flipping a switch quickly. Then there was a soft, uncanny pause. The kind of pause that makes you notice the refrigerator too loud and your own heartbeat. In that pause, every window in that tower went dark at once. I mean, every single one. The entire face of the building that had looked like a spread of lit rooms contracted into one shuttered silhouette. For a beat, I thought the transformer had failed. Then I looked at the other blocks and saw their lights still steady, taxis crawling past, people on the sidewalk talking on phones. It was just the tower. The dark was absolute and exactly simultaneous. No slow fade, no row-by-row blackout like when power companies shut lines down. It was a cut blink off. I raised my phone to record because you do that reflexively. The screen came up, the app opened, and the image stuttered into a smear. My phone logged no service again for a second and then came back. By the time I had the camera running, the tower lights had returned like nothing at all had happened. The neon sign shot back to its bright self as if someone had flicked the lights on. People in the street didn't scream or scatter. A woman on the corner who'd been smoking turned and kept smoking. 30 seconds, maybe less, of darkness, and then nothing. If you'd blinked, you would have missed it. My first impulse was to ask someone else if they'd seen it, so I leaned over the rail and called down to my neighbor Max, 2 floors below. He was the kind of guy who's up late and feeds pigeons on his window ledge, so he's awake for weird. "Hey, did you just see the tower?" I shouted. Max poked his head out, and I could see the glow of his TV inside his room, his hair all over. "What the blackout?" he asked, like I was behind on the neighborhood gossip. "Yeah, whole building went dark. I thought they were filming a movie up there." He didn't sound alarmed. He was trying to make himself not alarmed. I went downstairs. In the lobby, Carlos the Super was standing with his hand on the intercom. He'd been watching the street through the glass, and he was frowning, like people do when they've seen too many stop signs change at once. "Power dropped and came back," he said without being asked. "But only at that building. My cousin says sometimes when they test emergency systems in office towers, they do a quick whole building switchover." That sounded plausible. I tried to imagine maintenance crews with bright lamps and tool belts up top, and accepted the idea because adults invent plausible things to sleep at night. Back on the sidewalk, the building looked ordinary. The lobby doors were open, people came and went, and a trio of late shift coders smoked under the awning and argued about an app they were debugging. One of them said, "My wife texted me from the 22nd floor and said the lights went out and then came back." No one screamed or anything? Weird, right? And then the conversation slid back to bugs in the build like nothing odd had just occurred. I called Jenna again, and this time she was awake enough to be sharp. "Hospitals got a string of alarms go off for about 20 minutes, she said, but they were just the UPS test. People call in weird all the time. I asked if her hospital had any staff that night working in that exact tower. She said no, different area code. She told me to stop being dramatic. I wanted to be done with it. That's another thing you learn. If you overfixate on a small impossibility, it takes up a corner of your thinking like a bad splinter. Still, I couldn't shake the way the dark had come, like a single hand over a lamp. The simultaneity made it feel like someone had reached across a building and turned off rooms as if they were light bulbs on a long string. Phones started to pick up again, properly, an hour later. People posted pictures to social apps, flat images of a bright building and no visual evidence of the cut because most phones caught it either too early or too late. A tech blog had a short note from someone claiming the building's backup generator had tripped during a test, and everything was nominal. The building manager tweeted something corporate feeling. Brief, isolated power interruption resolved. The tweet used the word resolved in a way that is supposed to end conversations, but there were too many small, wedged details that didn't fit the tidy explanation. The smoke shop's camera feed near the intersection had gone dead for exactly 34 seconds, time-stamped, then returned as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Patel, who's always up at weird hours, swore she'd seen shadows moving inside the tower before the lights went out, like curtains shifting though the rooms were empty on that side. Max told me his building's lobby clock blinked once and then read a minute ahead for the rest of the night. My own wristwatch had a second hand that caught a beat later than it should have the next morning, like the day had hiccuped. A week passed, and the tower was its same illuminated self during the evenings. People went to work in it, cleaned it, left it, and walked under its awning without mentioning the cut, unless prompted. The city has a way of swallowing oddness into its routines. Still, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd stand on the balcony with nothing but the cold railing in my fingers and watch the block, counting the lit windows like a man counting sheep. Sometimes a pattern of lights would wink out in one office and then come back, like the old building was breathing, and I would blink back to steady myself. I never heard a siren that night for the tower. No emergency crews, no clamber of boots. If there was maintenance, it was quiet, precise, and handled with corporate calm. I emailed the building's management asking if they'd run tests. The only reply I got back was a boilerplate note. Routine maintenance and systems checks may occur. No impact to tenant operations. They thanked me for my patience. I came back inside after the first night and locked the balcony door behind me. I made a cup of coffee, pacing like a person who had seen something and wants it to be sensible. I sat at my table and watched the coffee steam like it marked time. My apartment felt like the rest of the city, functional, noisy in the right corners, indifferent. I slept eventually and kept schedules, paid rent, went to work. The tower's lights still blink and dim in that ordinary way. Once in a while they go dark for a second and then are back. Nothing official to tell you it isn't only your imagination. The thing I can't shake isn't that I saw a glow or that the windows darkened. It's the way everything lined up like a sentence and then left a blank where comprehension should have been. You tell yourself reasonable things, testing, a power hiccup, camera glitches, because you have to live here. But sometimes when I stand on the balcony, cigarette finished, and the city hums its low life around me, I find myself looking at that tower the way you keep an eye on a storm passing slow over the water. Not in fear, not in hope, but because it's a slice of the world behaving slightly off its script, and for reasons I don't have words for, I want to keep watching until the sentence makes sense. I was cruising at 2,500 feet, hand on the throttle, when something that shouldn't have been there slid up beside the left wing. My name's Mark Delaney. I fly a Cessna 172 for myself. Instruction work, odd ferry jobs, the kind of flying that keeps you honest about weather and stick and rudder. That morning, I'd taken off from the grass strip outside of town just after sunrise. It was a clear day, visibility excellent, little high cloud coming in over the range. I had the window cracked, the engine sounded like it always did, and the headset was doing its lazy job of keeping ATC and the world at a sensible distance. Before the thing showed up, there were small, stupid wrongs that I filed away and blamed on being human. About 10 minutes out, the GPS box hiccuped. The little moving map icon froze for a beat, and then jumped a quarter mile to the right, like it had misfiled my position. I glanced down, tapped the unit, and it went back to normal. My heading indicator gave a faint wobble, nothing a quick scan wouldn't sort, and the compass needle did that tiny nothing you would call it wobble pilots notice and say aloud, "Huh," and then look away. I told myself it was electrical noise, an odd bit of interference from a tower or a microwave dish somewhere breakfasting on the horizon. There were other moments that stacked up. A distant high-altitude airliner banked over the far ridge, and the radio static we usually accept as part of the morning chorus swelled for a second and then thinned out. A flock of blackbirds leaked across below us and made a neat silver pattern in the sunlight before scattering. The engine note, I swear to myself I noticed it for a half second lose the tiniest edge, like someone rolled off a piano key. All fixable, all things you talk yourself down from as you reach for a cup of cold coffee at Cloverleaf Fields. It was the kind of morning that lets you stay calm because everything you do has a check on it. Instruments, scan, repeat. Then the shape came up beside us. At first I thought it was another Cessna. Formation flying's common enough in this patchwork of training fields. I glanced in the left mirror, then out the side window. There was a silhouette keeping pace with us at our 12 o'clock, slightly above, maybe 200 feet off the left wing. The oddest thing was the angle. It wasn't oriented like a plane. It sat at a tilt, one edge pointing down into the valley, the other tipped up toward the cloud deck, as if someone had rotated it on an invisible hinge. It maintained that impossible attitude and didn't seem to care about the concept of lift. There were no nav lights, no strobes, nothing to give away the presence of wings or a tail. The surface looked matte, pale against the sky, just enough contrast to cut the sun's sheen into a soft outline. It made no sound, not the faint whine of turbine, not the wind rush you expect when something passes within earshot. For the fraction of a second, I thought of a glider or a banner tow or some experimental ultralight. Then I thought of the practicalities. No pilot would try to hold that angle in an updraft. No FAA-sanctioned glider flies without tow lines in controlled airspace. I did what you're trained to do. I called it in. Traffic at 2 o'clock, same altitude, unknown type, I said into the mic, voice steady enough. Requesting traffic advisory. My hands didn't tremble. You don't want to be the pilot who lets the airplane feel your nerves. The tower was the little approach desk over at the regional field, chipper voice, slow coffee tones. Say again, Mark? Traffic at 2 o'clock? They asked. I described what I could see. The position, the odd angle, the lack of strobes. I expected them to reply with the usual unable or no traffic observed, but I figured they'd at least say they saw something on primary radar. They didn't. We have no targets on the scope in that quadrant, Mark, the controller said. Squawk for us ident. I hit the transponder to 1200 and toggled ident. The little squawk light blinked dutifully, and the ATC voice came back a little flat. No secondary return. I'm not showing anything on primary or secondary in your vicinity. Altitudes, heading. I told them my altitude, heading, position, relative to landmarks. They read back nothing. The audio on the frequency ran normal. A Cessna inbound from the south asking for taxi, a maintenance truck requesting fuel, the world being the world. But the space beside me had that pale, silent presence that stayed level with my left wing. I kept glancing at it. It moved in sync with my plane, not with turbulence or wind. When I made a gentle 3-degree left turn to get a better view, it matched me, holding that slant exactly, never banking cleanly into the turn like a winged aircraft must. I thought about rolling the plane onto its back for a look, the kind of impulse that's almost stupid enough to be brave. Instead, I tightened my scan, kept an eye on instruments, watched the sky. The controller on the ground advised I climb to 3,000 to keep traffic separation. I acknowledged and slowly added power. The shape climbed with me, staying at our left at that impossible easeful angle, still silent enough that the only sounds in the headset were the pumps and the paper squeak of the ATC's log being turned. I repeated my sighting, told them it was maintaining position. The controller repeated back that her radar showed nothing. Mark, are you VFR clear? You're looking at a big bank of cloud to the west. You might be seeing a reflection or a sundog, she said, reasonable as a librarian. I considered sundog. Sundogs are explainable, nice, known. This wasn't a halo effect. This had shape and deliberate motion. I tried to use the hood of my glare shield to cast a shadow and see surface detail, anything. The outline stayed pastel. My brain started making catalogs of aircraft I know. No wings, no empennage, no prop wash. It had sides that suggested structure, not just a puff of cloud. When the angle let a breath of sunlight catch it, there was a subtle texture like brushed metal, dulled. My phone, tucked behind the yoke as a backup camera, was on a sputtering live app I'd tested once for a training piece. I thumbed it, but the app froze. The live feed pixelated and then smudged into blocks. I shoved it back. There's a tidy, ridiculous paranoia that comes with that. I kept imagining I'd suddenly gone blind to the rest of the world, and whatever was at my wing was the only thing that noticed I was there. Then it did the thing that unstitched me. It snapped upward. I don't mean climbed rapidly in a way I can quantify. I mean it shot from our altitude to above the cloud deck in a motion that was more a disappearance than acceleration, the way a cardiogram line plunges flat. One instant, the pale slant filled my peripheral vision. The next it had gone, and where it threaded the clouds, there was no contrail, no turbulence, nothing to mark the path. Radar replay later showed no primary blip. The controller's voice cut in as if on cue. "Say your status?" I could hear the slight pitch in her tone now, the professional calibration smelling like concern that's been told to behave. "Traffic's gone," I said, my voice low. "No visual." "Affirm, Mark. No targets on radar. Are you declaring an emergency?" I hadn't, and I kept myself from doing it because that would summon a set of procedures and people, and I wasn't sure what problem I was calling. I told them I was okay and would continue VFR to the airport. I circled on the expected arrival, did my checklists out loud because pilots do that to keep the machine of actions moving, and watched the cloud bank where the shape had vanished as if it might leak the thing back out. There are mundane ways this could have been explained. A reflection on a lens, a trick of low sun on the edge of cloud, some kind of experimental unmanned thing with stealth tech. But the evidence wasn't tidy. The instruments didn't glitch long enough to be comprehensible. The radar at 2 different centers logged nothing. My own handheld camera unreadably corrupted the frames it tried to take, and the pigeons I saw the day before at the field looked nowhere near as ruffled as I felt. On the ground, the maintenance guys were sympathetic but standard issue skeptical. They asked if I'd filed a report. I filed one with the flight service desk more out of habit than hope. The controller emailed me the radar replay they could share, a flat gray line, planes where they ought to be, a blank space where my brain insisted the thing had been. The replay showed a 9-second smear of noise in one sector, then clean data. The log for the frequency showed my transmission and the short pause where the controller indexed a query and then normal chatter. There were no UFO show headlines in the morning paper, just a brief note in the airport maintenance log about a pilot reporting unidentified traffic. I drove home through a fog that had moved into the valley, hands warm on the steering wheel, and tried to sleep that night by counting the checklist items for an approach over and over because it steadies me. I told a handful of pilot friends, and their faces slid into the professional tolerance for the strange and then back. One of them, Lisa, who flies charters out of the coast, said people see weird things sometimes, bright objects, reflections, lights, and she shrugged in the way of someone who knows the margin for error in eyes and instruments. Another sent me a clip of a Chinese research paper about radar anomalies over mountain ranges, but admitted it didn't quite match. What stays with me isn't a sensation of cosmic terror. It's the specific ordinariness of it, the prop, the needles, the hum of breath in the headset. The thing had been precise in its wrongness. The most practical fact is this. I flew the plane back, logged my time, did the squawk test, and walked away with my logbook the same, my passengers none the wiser. No one was harmed. I came home, drank too much coffee, and looked out the kitchen window at the sky until it was daylight and normal. I don't have a neat ending. The radar file I was sent is a flat line with a small notch of static where my words met their blanks. The camera files are corrupted in a way that leaves me with a smeared frame in the middle of a clear take. People I told either ask practical questions or smile in a way that says, "Pilot stories are full of weather." I keep thinking about the way it matched my turn, the way it climbed without passing through the wake, the exactness of its timing. I fly again, because the job and because flying is what I know how to do when the sky feels otherwise. I was tracking a deer that had vanished into the lower saplings when I heard the first click. Name's Eli Mercer. I hunt around the Hollis Ridge a couple times a month. Public land, rough track, enough oak and hemlock that the deer have places to hide and a man can practice patience. I had taken the little logging trail farther than I usually do because the wind was good and there'd been fresh sign. A scrape, a rub, a faint drag in the leaves. It was late October and the dusk came quick. The air was the cold kind that makes your lungs taste like metal. I'd been wearing my orange vest, had the Thompson over my shoulder, the bipod folded under, and my old Zeiss scope on the rifle. I like that scope. It's simple, clear, none of that glare nonsense. The woods were the usual evening orchestra when I left the truck. Cicadas winding down, a thin line of crickets, occasional far-off bark of hounds. By the time I pushed through the last stand of saplings, the songs were thinning, and the sky over the ridge was the flat color of old nickel. The light was going the way it always does out there, honest and fast. I wasn't worried about being late. I'd planned on moving slow, following the scrape. The first odd thing was small. The birds cut out. 1 second there were robins and a thrush working the understory, and then nothing. A hard quiet slid over the ridge like someone pulled a blanket. It's not the kind of quiet that means there's a storm coming. It was the animal hush, the one that settles when something in the woods has noticed something and decided to be polite about alarm. My hair went a little up on my neck. I kept moving but quieter, and the sound of my own boots on leaf litter sounded too loud. A minute later, something knocked. 3 times. Not a branch falling, not the hollow knuck of a woodpecker. 3 clean, hollow clicks, spaced, echoing uphill and then settling into the trees. The sound came from above me, not out ahead or behind. It was sharp enough that I stopped and put a hand on my rifle barrel purely out of habit. I didn't want to look up because up is where you see the sky, and I wanted the deer, but I had to. I saw the trunks, the branches, the gray sky, and then the second click, and my head went up. There was a dark triangle moving just above the treetops, matte black. No shine. It wasn't high and it wasn't low, just barely clearing the canopy. The edges were straight, the shape precise, the underside flat against the sky like someone had laid a board over the tops of the trees. It moved with a slow, deliberate glide. No sound. Nothing like the trucked-in chatter of a crop duster or the obvious sweep of a satellite. If I squinted, it was like a paper airplane cut out of shadow and set loose. I've seen owls and big raptors sit on thermals at dusk and their noisy wings even at a distance. This thing made no sound. There was no rotor wash bending the highest branches, no echo of a whine through the holler. It passed over the oaks with a movement that felt patient, like it was scanning the ground for something and taking its time. The second time it passed my position, because it made a slow circle, I heard 2 more clicks, spaced the same as the first 3. After the last echo, the birds stayed quiet. I remember the ordinary things that happened to keep my own head steady. Check the safety, keep the barrel pointed downrange, breathe slow. I learned long ago not to do anything dramatic in the woods. I shouldered the rifle and eased to a knoll so I could see the ridge line ahead. My scope was dialed for distance. I lifted and the reticle found the triangle as a dark patch against a steel sky. That's when the scope fogged from the inside. I'll never forget that little dot of steam that gathered under the glass like a mouthy exhale. It clouded across the lenses and blurred the silhouette into soft charcoal. I took the rifle down to my knee and wiped the eyepiece with my sleeve. Nothing. The fog was on the inside and it smeared no matter how I wiped. It cleared a hair at the center where I'd breathed and then blurred again. I set the butt of the rifle into my shoulder and tried to look along the barrel, past the glass, and the triangle, when I could make it out, had slid down between the trees and come back up along a different vector, like it was mapping the understory. It wasn't a plane, not in any way I know. I thought maybe some hunter with a homemade kite or a remote glider, but anyone piloting that low would make sound and leave a wake in branches. No wake. When it was over the north copse again, it seemed to hesitate and then accelerate. One clean motion, almost vertical, and the sky swallowed it. There was no contrail, no vapor, no sound of blades cutting air. The only thing left was my breath fogging because I'd suddenly held my breath too long. When it lifted like that, time didn't jump exactly, but my watch was off. I checked the cheap digital on my wrist because old habits are good. It read 5:26. I remember thinking I'd been out longer. My mind had been counting minutes, and they felt longer, like someone stretched a strip of film. Later that night, the watch would be 2 minutes different from the truck clock. That's the kind of small wrong that nags you more than a big wrong does. After the triangle vanished, the birds came back in a cautious ripple. A squirrel barked its complaint 3 trees over. The wind crept in, and the woods resumed the ordinary hiss they always have. My legs were rubbery, but I'm not proud of sharp panic. I worked my way back along the deer's path slowly, keeping my shoulders low and my steps soft. The scrape was real, fresh, like the buck had only just moved through. Antler hair stuck to the bark. Tracks in the mud. Whatever had been up there moved like it was studying ground sign. I told myself a dozen reasonable things on the walk back. Maybe a late hunter had a bird hunting decoy on a line. Maybe someone had launched a dark kite from a clearing. Maybe I'd misread distance and the triangle was farther away than it looked. The problem with each theory was the scope fog. I'm a practical man, and equipment leaves traces. You get fog from moisture and temperature shifts, from breathing when the glass is cold, from using a lens in rain. But fools forget the absurdity that things like scope fogging from the inside feel less like nature and more like an object touching the same space your eyes use. I reached the truck before full dark. The parking pullout was empty, but for the dull glow of my brake lights. The heater in the cab was still warm from earlier. I sat with the engine idling and fingers on the wheel while the wool of my jacket dried slowly. I thumbed open my phone, but bars were scarce the way they get under canopy. A text from Louis, my buddy who usually meets me at the ridge now and then, blinked. "You call me?" He'd been in town and said he'd seen 2 kids with a drone near the feed store earlier, but he shrugged it off. I didn't want to make small talk. I drove home slow on the holler roads, headlights cutting the mist. The radio caught a faint AM hymn station and then went silent for a stretch where static swallowed whole songs. I thought about reporting it to the game warden, but the last time I'd called in on something odd, someone's fire that turned out to be a controlled burn, made me feel small. There's a kind of private shame in telling a story that can be shrugged away. So I told no one at first, not until I'd sat in the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt paper and listened to its steam. The scope cleared in the place it always clears, when the ambient temp inside the cab met the glass and the condensation evaporated. I cleaned the lens with a proper rag later and looked for salt or residue. Nothing. I can't find fingerprints for reasons that make sense. At the rifle shop the next weekend, a man named Gabe told me sometimes scopes fog in weird ways. He had 100 explanations. Seals that fail, tiny breaks where humidity gets in on a long hunt. He checked the eyepiece, turned the tube in the sun, and handed it back like a man dealing with the weather. I slept badly that night. My dog, Rex, padded in and out of the bedroom like he was checking doors. In the middle of the night, I went outside and stood by the back fence with a cigarette and watched the ridge. There was nothing, only the flat wash of stars I'm used to seeing. Occasionally a plane traced across the sky far high, polite and loud enough you knew it had engines. None of them were that triangle. I thought about what it had done, how it had wound along the treetops as if reading every line of bark. I thought about how my scope criticized me in that exact moment and how easily all the world goes back to normal after something odd slips by. I told Luis the next afternoon because not saying things makes them larger in your head. He listened and clicked his tongue a few times. "You sure it wasn't a banner tow or parasail?" he said. He asked if I had trail cam footage or quick notes. I had nothing. The other men at the feed store had their own stories, little bright things over cornfields in summer, a light that hung by a silo and then moved on. We swapped tales like old men swap recipes, half one-up and half disbelief. No one offered a satisfying explanation. A week passed and I went back to the ridge twice because hunting is what you do and you don't hand your woods over to a memory. Nothing else turned up. The deer were where deer are, the rut moved along and the world stayed the world. But every time the sky on a late afternoon went that steel nickel color, I found my eyes lifting without meaning to, tracking the treetops for a clean black edge. There are things I can't prove and things I know I saw. The triangle was one of them. My truck clock and my watch disagree by 2 minutes if you ask them. Annoying, small, unnecessary. My scope fogged from the inside, and I can't find a mechanical reason for it that sits clean in the world. The woods sometimes muzzled their sounds in a way that put me on my heels. None of it culminated in a catastrophe. I came home, I cleaned my rifle, I mended a strap on my pack, I went back out the next weekend with a friend. We walked the rusted boots path and left our own marks. The compass didn't twitch and the birds sang again. At night, when the house is quiet and the kettle is making its small protest, I will catch myself glancing up at the tree line from the kitchen window like a man habitually checking his doors. The ridge looks ordinary under the moon. But the odd little things sit in my head in a row, the clicks first among them, and I find myself slowing down when I pass any stand of oaks, listening for anything that isn't wind. I was driving home from work on that Thursday around 7:30 in the evening. The sky had that dull pink hue that comes right before full sunset, nothing dramatic, just that sort of washed out color that makes the trees look darker than they are. I had left the office later than usual because of a pile of paperwork, and the highway was practically empty except for a few other cars heading the same way. I usually take the county road that cuts past the old Miller farm, the one that's been abandoned for years. The fields there stretch out for miles, flat and wide, with nothing to block the view. I like it because it's peaceful, even when I'm stuck thinking about work. That night, though, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my own windshield, or maybe a glint off a silo, I don't know. But it stayed in the same spot as I drove closer, so that didn't make sense. I slowed down and squinted. Hovering just above the northern edge of the field was a silver object. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a small car, but it was completely still in the air. No blinking lights, no rotor noise, nothing. Just this reflective silver shape, perfectly stationary. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light, but it stayed there as I got nearer. I even rolled down the window, half expecting to hear wind or some kind of mechanical hum. There was nothing except the normal sounds of the road and my tires on the asphalt. I don't know why, but I instinctively took the next left onto the old gravel road that runs along the field. I wanted a better angle, maybe to see if I could make out details. The gravel crunched under my tires and the car's headlights swept across the field as I slowed to a stop. And it was gone. The field was empty. Just the grass and wildflowers and the outline of a fence at the far end. No object, no shimmer, no nothing. I checked around, even drove back and forth slowly, hoping I just misjudged the angle. Nothing. Not even a shadow where it had been hovering. I sat in the car for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavy, warmer than it had been just a minute ago, and I noticed the usual sounds of evening. The crickets, the wind through the grass, were quieter than normal, almost muted. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my eyes had caught a reflection off a cloud, or maybe the sun lingering on a piece of metal. But my gut told me I hadn't. There was a clarity to the shape, a presence. I drove slowly back onto the main road, keeping my eyes on the field. Still nothing. The world had resumed its normal rhythm. The birds that were still awake chirped, a distant dog barked, and the faint hum of a tractor from a neighbor's property drifted over. Everything normal, except for what I had seen. I took a detour through the next subdivision, trying to shake the unease. Lights came on in houses as people returned from work. Kids yelled from yards. Nothing seemed out of place except me, my pulse, and that image I couldn't erase. At one point, I caught a glint in the rearview mirror, something low to the ground, reflective again, but when I swerved slightly to look, it was gone. No vehicle, no animal, just the road and empty yards. I shook my head, laughed quietly at myself, and kept driving. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had fully set, leaving a soft violet haze over the neighborhood. I left the car running for a moment, staring out at the horizon beyond my house. The field past the next row of houses was dark, nothing to hint at what I'd seen. Inside, my husband asked how the drive was. I told him uneventful, nothing to report. I couldn't bring myself to describe it. The words felt wrong or too weird, or maybe I wasn't sure I believed them myself. That night, when I went to bed, I kept seeing it in my mind. The object, hovering perfectly still, reflecting light off its surface, as if it had weight but no sound. My dreams were fragmented, nothing concrete, just flashes of silver against pink sky, like looking through the corner of my own memory. The next day, I drove past the field again during my lunch break. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No disturbance in the grass, no evidence it had been there. The farm was as empty as ever, weeds growing along the fence line, the old barn doors hanging loose. A week later, I asked a coworker if they'd seen anything unusual, planes, helicopters, even a hot air balloon. They said no. I tried online forums about strange sightings in the area, but found nothing that matched the time or place. Still, I catch myself glancing at that field whenever I drive past, hoping maybe for a glimpse again. Most days it's just grass and fence posts and the fading remains of the old barn. But some nights, especially when the light hits the horizon just right, I swear I can see a silver shimmer, low and still, hovering above the grass, waiting. I've driven that road dozens of times since, alone and with friends, during the day and at dusk. Nothing ever appears again, but the memory of that shape, perfectly still, and the way the evening grew quiet around it, hasn't left me. Even now, when I pass the field, I check the sky first, just in case. I pulled over on a rutted 2-track when the sky went weird. I'd been chasing the cell all afternoon, hot, muggy air bulging off the highway, the kind of late May day that makes the whole sky feel like it's waiting. My name's Ben. I do freelance storm work with a beat-up Subaru and a dash cam that's seen better storms. I wasn't out for a record or fame, just the next decent wall cloud and whatever footage I could stitch together for the weather shows. The field off County Road 12 had a dark, low base, and the wind had that tight metallic smell before anything obvious happened. I killed the engine, put the camera on the hood, and watched. A few small things felt off before anything really happened. First, the birds. The swallows that had been skimming over a drainage ditch 2 minutes earlier vanished like someone closed a curtain. It wasn't just quieter. The entire layer of little flight calls stopped dead. Then my radio started to hiss. Not the usual chatter, but a thin, high static that would climb and fall without a pattern. My phone, which had been steady on full bars, flashed "no service" for a beat, and then came back as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was all normal. Atmospheric propagation, ionospheric weirdness, whatever the forecasters say when radios play up. But my gut notice is old at this. I've been out on nights where storms behaved normally, and nights where they didn't. And that bird silence was the sort that tightens your shoulders. The wall cloud dropped fast. 1 minute, the base was low and things smooth. The next, it had a lip and a darker core. Wind gusted from the southeast, and the tall corn in the fields lay flat in sheets. I could hear the blades of the grass snap under pressure in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I threw the dash cam at the windshield mount, which doesn't do much but keeps a steady picture for whatever I catch. That's when the funnel dropped. Thin at first, then thickening like someone had pulled taffy. It didn't look cinematic. It looked practical. A rope of condensed cloud with dust beginning to spiral at its base. Trucks on the far county road slowed to a crawl. A farmer in a pickup turned off his lights and parked on the shoulder. He waved at me like we were sharing a private thing of necessity. And then the lights appeared. Inside the pipe, maybe halfway up the visible column, 3 lights were locked in place. They weren't strobes or aircraft nav lights. They were steady, sharp, white, arranged roughly in a triangle with one point downward. The funnel was whipping and tearing at the field, and the air around it had teeth, but those lights sat steady as a lamp on a table. They didn't jitter with the gusts. They didn't smear with the speed of the rotation. It looked wrong in the exact, precise way that makes every hair on your neck honest. I raised my camera and zoomed until the image pixelated. The lights held. My recorder picked up nothing different. No extra frequencies, no mechanical whine. Just the ambient roar of wind and distant thunder. I got out of the car because That's what you do. You want the unobstructed angle, the sound that fills the chest. The porch of old corn and telephone poles leaned under the pressure of the storm. When I walked forward, the grit of soil was knocked at my boots like little bullets. A bolt hit to my left, bright, close, and it cracked the world open like a fist. The three lights vanished the instant the lightning lanced through the column. One fraction of a second they were there, the next nothing in that exact patch of sky. The funnel went on. No dramatic collapse at that moment, but the memory of those lights had a kind of absence, the shape of a hand. I blinked hard and checked the footage. The file shows the funnel and then a bright flash, and then the funnel continuing without its interior lights. After the strike, the whole storm acted like a thing embarrassed. Winds shifted, the gust front rolled through, and what had been a steady climb of electricity dropped into regular thunder. The radio that had been hissing came back to life with a dispatcher asking for reports. My phone chirped a dozen messages from other chasers. Did you see that? Lights inside? One text had a shaky clip from a passenger in another car. The lights are visible on a few frames and then gone. People started to respond in real time, trading coordinates and guesses like a sport. I drove closer when the funnel moved off the field and the county patrol waved traffic away. The farmer's truck was gone. He'd already headed to his cellar. I parked under a telephone pole because it felt safer for reasons I couldn't explain and watched the cloud pull east. For a long time afterward, all the small electronics around me behaved like a fridge motor. They hummed and clicked, a beat late. My headlamp dimmed for a second when I tried to jog video on a small handheld, and the minute it came back, the footage had a single frame where the lights were bright and then nothing. People in town called it later a power surge, a trick of light. I called it what it was, the footage in my camera and the farmer's dash cam backing me up. The National Weather Service logged an event. A tornado touchdown reported no fatalities, property damage minimal. They didn't say anything about 3 steady lights in a rotating column. Official reports don't usually do that. I sent the raw clip to a couple of meteorologist friends, and one of them emailed me back with a cautious, interesting. Glints off hail, maybe? With a shrug emoji. Another asked for GPS timestamps. I packed up before the storm could remind me how small we are. Driving back to the county line, the field smelled like wet iron and corn, and something clung to the air that my chest kept trying to measure. I was tired in the way people are after close, precise fear, awake and too alert. I went home, unloaded the rig, and watched the footage again on my laptop with the sound down, pausing at the frames where the lights sat like frozen buds inside the funnel. I posted a clipped version to my feed for other chasers, the comments filled with reasonable, skeptical, and excitable replies. That's the mix storms attract. By morning, everything on the field looked like it had always looked. Flattened rows in the corn, a few broken fence posts, a farmer who squinted at me over his coffee and said he'd seen the funnel but didn't see no lights, boy. I don't blame him. People look at weather and see what they know how to see. I kept the raw files and the timestamps and a jaw that felt a little loose from the thunder. I don't have an answer. The footage is there, and I have the memory of 3 steady points holding inside a thing that should have torn them to pieces. I have a dash cam, a farmer's video, and a radio log that shows a spike at the exact second the flash hits. I slept that night with the laptop closed and the phone on the bedside table. The next day, I drove past the county road where I'd left the car, and the grass bent the same way. People go back to work. Corn keeps swelling. The sky keeps doing what sky does. The lights are still in my camera files, stubborn and inexplicable, and I keep opening them, not because I want an answer, but because I want to remember precisely what looked wrong against everything we think we understand. I was stationed at a site near Groom Lake in 2011, working as a junior radar tech. Nothing glamorous. Most of my shifts were spent in a dimly lit control room with 2 other guys, watching screens that hardly ever changed. We monitored air traffic around the ranges, logged activity, checked for anomalies. 90% of the time, it was dull. Training flights, test patterns, calibration runs. You write down the times, keep the data clean, and hand it off at the end of the shift. It was the middle of summer. One of those weeks where the desert heat doesn't really let up, even at night. I was on the midnight shift, which usually meant just staring at a radar scope for hours while sipping bad coffee and trying not to fall asleep. The room had no windows, just the low hum of the equipment and the occasional squawk from a headset if there was traffic. Around 0140, something unusual popped up on my screen. A return registered at the far edge of the runway, like something had just powered up there. At first I thought it was a glitch, maybe a reflection or bad data, but the track was solid, not flickering like noise. It looked exactly like an aircraft preparing for takeoff. I marked it in the log, like I was supposed to. New contact, runway origin, holding position. Nothing odd yet, but I remember leaning closer, frowning at the scope. The altitude read 0, the speed almost nothing, but the return was sharp. Then, in a blink, the blip shot forward. The system updated so fast it almost smeared across the display. The acceleration wasn't gradual, it went from stationary to hundreds of knots instantly. Within 2 sweeps of the radar, it had cleared the base perimeter. By the 3rd sweep, it was off the scale. I stared at the numbers. The speed readout climbed past Mach 3, then Mach 6, then it stopped showing anything useful. The system just dumped dashes, like it couldn't calculate anymore. I called over to Jim, another tech who'd been there longer than me. "Hey, you seeing this?" He rolled his chair over, squinting at my scope. For a second, his mouth opened like he was going to say something. Then he leaned back, rubbed his face, and muttered, "Don't." He turned away without another word and went back to his own console. I sat there, heart hammering, watching the blip streak off into nothing. The track line stretched to the edge of the display and vanished. I wrote it down anyway. 0143, unknown departure, impossible acceleration. I underlined it because my brain couldn't process what I'd just seen. Less than a minute later, the entry blinked off my log, just gone. The line I'd typed was replaced with an empty row, like it had never existed. I tried re-entering it, but the system wouldn't let me. The cursor just refused to move onto that time slot. I checked the backup console, same thing. Clean logs, no trace of what I'd just watched. Before I could say anything, the supervisor came in. It was unusual for him to check in that late, but there he was, coffee cup in hand, expression flat. He walked straight over to me, looked at my screen, then at me. "You didn't see anything," he said. His voice wasn't threatening, but it was final. I tried to say something. It logged a takeoff, sir, but..." He cut me off. "No, it didn't. Don't put it in writing again. Don't talk about it again." "Clear?" I nodded. My mouth was dry. He stared at me another moment, then walked out like it was just another routine check. The rest of the shift crawled by. I couldn't stop glancing at the runway on the scope, half expecting something else to appear. Nothing did. By the time morning came, I felt like I dreamed the whole thing. But when I left the building, I noticed something strange. The air outside smelled faintly metallic, almost like ozone after a lightning strike, even though the sky was perfectly clear. The guards at the gate were quieter than usual too, faces unreadable behind their sunglasses, like they were waiting for something. That day, I went back to my quarters and lay on the bunk for hours, replaying it in my head. A craft leaving the runway, accelerating faster than anything I'd ever heard of, then vanishing from the radar in seconds. Logs auto-cleared. Supervisor shutting it down immediately. I worked there another 7 months. Nothing like that ever showed on my screen again. But I also never stopped thinking about how quick my supervisor had been to appear. Like he already knew what had happened before I even called it out. When my contract was up, I left Nevada and never reapplied. I told myself it was just a glitch, a bad read. But I know what I saw on that scope, and I know I didn't imagine the way the data disappeared right in front of me. I was going through some old storage boxes at home a few months back trying to declutter when I came across a stack of photos my grandfather had kept. He was a retired airman, Charles Chuck Whitman, and spent most of his career around the Nevada Test and Training Range. I'd grown up hearing stories about the base, Area 51, all the usual stuff, secret projects, experimental aircraft, but never much concrete. I guess I thought the stories were just that, stories. Anyway, these photos were mostly black and white from the 50s. Chuck had labeled some of them, mostly snapshots of runways, barracks, the occasional aircraft lined up neatly on the tarmac. Nothing too unusual. I was flipping through them on a rainy Sunday morning, sunlight dim through the blinds, when I stopped at one photo that didn't make sense. It was a standard runway shot, taken from what looked like a guard tower. You could see a few trucks and personnel moving about. Nothing that screamed classified at first glance. But then I noticed something in the background, half hidden behind a hangar. A craft. It was small, sleek, dark, with a shape that didn't resemble anything I recognized from the period. No wings like a jet, no tail fins, just smooth, almost teardrop shaped. The strange part, it looked identical to a prototype I'd seen a few years ago during a test briefing at the base. Same size, same shape, same metallic reflection. I blinked a few times, leaning closer. Couldn't be. That aircraft shouldn't exist in the 50s. I called my cousin, Matt, who's a hobbyist historian with a focus on Cold War aviation. He looked at it over video chat, adjusting the contrast and zooming in on the background. "That's weird," he said finally. "It looks like one of the newer stealth test drones. But this photo is dated 1954. How does that even happen?" I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the labeling was wrong. But then I pulled out more photos from the same box, various angles of the same base, all from the early 50s. Each time, in the same corner of the frame, there it was. Always partially obscured, never fully in focus, almost like someone or something was careful not to let you get a clear look. That evening, I dug out some of Chuck's old notebooks. They weren't much at first, flight logs, maintenance notes, but in one of the later journals dated 1953, I found a reference to a special operations prototype with only a vague description. Unconventional, smooth, unmarked, observed only in limited test conditions. No drawings, no technical details. I drove down to the range the next morning. I figured maybe seeing the area would help me contextualize what I'd found. The desert was quiet, early fog rolling off the mountains. I parked near the perimeter, far enough to avoid attention, and watched the horizon. Not more than 30 minutes in, I saw a glint, a shape rising from behind one of the distant hangars. It hovered briefly, then shot straight up at a speed that made me stumble back. My camera's autofocus freaked out. I managed a single frame before it vanished behind a low bank of clouds. The weirdest part wasn't just seeing the craft. It was that when I checked the photo, there was a faint haze, almost like static, covering the shape. The camera had registered movement, but somehow the outline wasn't fully there. My heart was racing, and I noticed that my surroundings felt different. The desert was too quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the usual hum from the distant generators. Just that odd, empty silence. I stayed for a couple more hours, watching. Every now and then, small lights would flicker across the horizon, like someone moving reflective markers, except nothing appeared on the ground when I tried to track them. I felt like I was being watched, though every time I spun around, there was no one. Just the desert, the mountains, and the base perimeter fencing. On my way back, I noticed my car felt lighter. Not physically, but the sense that something had changed in my perspective. Like time had stretched, then compressed. I got home and everything seemed normal, except for the photo I had taken. Half the image was blank where the craft had been. I tried reloading it, connecting the SD card to my computer, even opening it in different programs. Nothing. It just wouldn't show the craft. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo from the 50s. How had that craft been there? Was someone testing advanced technology decades ahead of schedule, or was it something else entirely? Chuck never mentioned anything like that in his journals, at least not in words I could understand. And the craft I saw rising from behind the hangar looked identical, down to the subtle curvature of its body, to the one in the old photograph. The following week, I went back to the storage box just to see if I had missed anything. There were more photos, more angles, but in all of them, the craft was there, partially hidden, always in the background. The more I looked, the more I felt like it had been watching, like it didn't want to be fully seen. I tried asking around carefully to people I trusted. Nobody had seen anything, and some gave me that blank, uneasy look like they thought I'd gone off the deep end. Military records for that period are classified, naturally, but even among retired personnel, no one would admit to having knowledge of something like that. I kept the photos, of course. I sometimes take them out and study the hanger angles, the shadows, the background. And sometimes late at night, I imagine the craft rising from behind the hangar, just like it did that foggy morning, silent, fast, and completely untraceable. I don't know what it is, a prototype hidden for decades, something that doesn't belong to us, or maybe it's a trick of light, memory, and the desert stretching your mind. All I know is that photo doesn't lie, even if no one else can see it. And seeing that same shape today, decades later, hovering above the same base, made me realize that whatever it is, it doesn't obey our rules. I've stopped trying to explain it. I just look at the photos, sometimes the video I caught, and leave it at that. There's a line in the desert, and apparently I walked right up to it. The craft exists in the past and present, but every recording, every attempt to document it, seems determined to vanish. All I can do is keep the images, keep the memory, and accept that there's something out there that doesn't care about our timeline, our cameras, or our understanding. I went back to work, to the normal routines of life, but every now and then, when the wind shifts just right, I see that same shape in the corner of my eye, and I remember the photo from the 50s. It's still there, watching, waiting, and somehow unchanged. I was driving back from visiting my sister, the road stretching out in long, flat lines between the fields, the kind of country road that feels endless when the sun's just starting to dip behind the horizon. It was that strange time of day, the sky bruised with pinks and purples, and the air was quiet except for the faint buzz of cicadas and the tires on gravel. I hadn't seen another car in 10 miles. As I passed the first farm, I noticed the horses in the paddock. At first, I thought one of them had stopped mid-step because I caught it at a weird angle. But then I realized every single horse, every cow, every goat, even the few chickens wandering near the fence, they'd all frozen. Just like statues, necks craned upward, eyes locked on the same point in the sky. I slowed the truck, craning my neck to see what they were staring at. And then I saw it. A pale light, circular, hovering just above the far edge of the fields. It wasn't moving, not drifting, not bobbing in the wind. It just hung there, perfectly still, like someone had pressed pause on it. The color was weird, white but not bright, not like a spotlight. Softer, almost like the glow of a full moon, except it didn't illuminate the ground. The fields stayed dark in the shadows. I stopped the truck completely, the engine ticking over in the silence. I fumbled for my phone, trying to take a picture, but the screen just refused to capture it properly. Every shot came out like a white smear, no shape, no edges, nothing that looked like what I was seeing. I frowned, looked back at the animals. They hadn't moved. Every hoof, every feather, every ear pointed the same way, unblinking. I felt my stomach twist. I remember thinking that it had to be something natural, some weird trick of the light or a reflection. Maybe an early stage of lightning from some distant storm. But the sky was clear, no clouds, no haze, nothing that would make a light hang like that. And I swear there was no sound. Usually in the country at dusk you hear wind in the corn, a distant dog, a tractor in the distance. But for that stretch of road, it was dead silent. I sat in the truck for what I thought was maybe a minute, but my watch later told me it was closer to 5, just staring. The light didn't change, didn't pulse, didn't even flicker. Then slowly, like it was breathing, it shrank a little. I blinked, and it was gone. Just gone, the sky dark and empty again, leaving the stars beginning to pop out overhead. I blinked again and looked down at the fields. The animals were moving now, shaking themselves, stomping, calling out like nothing had happened. Horses ran toward the barn, cows wandered lazily back to their feeding spots, chickens clucked and scattered. I rubbed my eyes, half expecting the light to reappear, to see them stiff and staring once more. But they were just animals again, ordinary and oblivious. I started driving again, slow, checking the rearview mirror for movement behind me, but the road stretched empty. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing up, expecting to see the light trailing me, something keeping pace, but the sky was just the sky. A mile or so down the road, I noticed the first signs that something felt off beyond the memory of that light. The crickets had gone completely quiet, not one, not a single chirp. The wind that had been brushing across the fields had stopped, leaving a strange, unnatural stillness. I caught the hairs on my arms rising, and I realized I couldn't hear my own breathing properly anymore, like the silence was pressing in. I passed another farm. Normally there would be dogs barking, some old barn cat visible in the light of a window. Nothing. The animals inside the pens didn't even stir as I drove by, and for a second I swore the shadows of the buildings were moving ever so slightly, like the structures themselves were shifting. But when I blinked, everything was normal again. By the time I turned onto the highway leading toward my town, the night had deepened. Streetlights started to appear, the smell of asphalt warming in the residual heat of the day filled the air, and the world seemed to snap back into familiar focus. It was as if that stretch of road, those farms, that light, had been a pocket of some other reality, tucked inside the ordinary one. I called Maggie as soon as I got home. She didn't answer at first, and I was half relieved. I didn't want to sound crazy. When she finally picked up, I told her about the light, about the animals, about the silence. She paused, a long silence, and then said, "You're not the first one this week. Some guy saw a pale circle hovering near the old Miller farm, out by County Road 12. It was the same night, same time. I had no idea how he could have known or why, or what the hell we were both seeing miles apart. And that was the strangest part. Not that I'd seen something I couldn't explain, but that it seemed like someone or something through our little stretch of the world, touching it briefly, leaving no trace, and then vanishing. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that pale circle hovering in the sky, the animals frozen in place, the silence pressing down like a weight. I drove the same road a few days later during the day, and everything was normal. Horses were eating, cows were lowing, the wind moved the trees. Nothing abnormal at all. But I keep thinking about the edges of that light, how it didn't illuminate, how it didn't make a sound, and how when it disappeared, everything went back to ordinary, like it had never happened. I can't explain it, and honestly, I don't know that I want to. I still drive past that stretch at dusk sometimes. I check the fields, the fences, the animals, and every so often when the wind dies down, when the light is fading just right, I swear I see a faint shimmer in the sky, a pale circle holding itself just above the horizon, and I have to remind myself to keep going. I was up early around 5:30 a.m. trying to get a run in before the sun fully hit the mountains. It was that thick autumn fog that rolls down the valleys and sticks to the trails. You know, the kind where the trees look like blurry silhouettes and the ground seems softer underfoot. I like running alone in the mornings. Just me, my rhythm, and the trail. That day, though, something felt off almost immediately. About a mile in, I started hearing it. The dogs. Not just the usual occasional bark, but all of them at once, from the neighborhood down the slope, a deep, continuous barking that cut through the fog. At first I thought maybe a coyote or a bear had gotten near the houses, but the sound was different, sharp, synchronized, almost frantic, hundreds of yards apart, all barking together. It stopped me cold in my tracks. I stood there listening, heart picking up, the fog curling around me like it was alive. Then I saw it. Not at first, not clearly. A small white orb floated through the fog a little way ahead on the trail, just above the ground. It moved slowly, almost gliding. And for a second I thought it was a reflection of my headlamp off moisture, or maybe a stray light from someone's porch. But as I focused, it held its shape, steady, like it was aware I was looking. The dog's barking quieted immediately when the orb paused. Just silence. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The trail felt colder, though the air temperature hadn't changed. I fumbled for my phone to try and get a photo, but the signal was gone. 0 bars. Not unusual up in the mountains sometimes, but this was right where I usually have reception. I stared at the orb, and then it moved again, drifting toward a ridge above the trail. I thought about calling someone, but every instinct told me to stay quiet and still. My chest tightened. The fog thickened around the ridge, and then it was gone. Just gone. 1 second it was hovering there, the next nothing. The silence was uncanny. Even the air seemed still, no wind, no rustle, nothing. I started jogging again, slower this time, listening. The dogs had stopped barking entirely. I could hear my own footsteps, but nothing else. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not the wind through the pines. I kept moving for a few minutes, checking behind me, checking the ridge, but the fog didn't change, nothing reappeared. My phone still had no signal. I tried calling my partner, but nothing connected. Eventually, after maybe 20 minutes, it came back. I was too shaken to even check messages. The rest of the run was uneventful. I went slower, stayed on the main trail, and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A trick of the light, a reflection, maybe a distant lantern that moved strangely through the fog. But the way it paused, the way the dogs reacted, and that silence afterward, I can't explain that. When I got home, I checked the neighborhood. The houses were normal, dogs were back to barking at normal morning sounds, nothing seemed disturbed. I asked a neighbor later if their dogs had been up that morning. They said yes, they went crazy for a little while, then quieted, but no one could explain why. Another neighbor tried calling in from the road to see if anyone had a light out, some kind of early morning work, but no one had been outside. I went back up the trail the next day, the fog lighter, and nothing happened. No orb, no dogs barking, no strange stillness. Everything was normal, almost unnaturally so. The trail markers I usually pass were untouched, the trees just trees, the valley just a valley. I ran the same stretch again the following week, morning fog, early hours, and nothing. I keep thinking about it though. The orb, the synchronized barking, the complete silence that followed. How something that small could command that kind of reaction in animals is beyond me. And the signal disappearing like that, it wasn't long, but enough to make it feel like I'd stepped into a pocket where the usual rules didn't apply. I've gone back to jogging the trail, but I try to avoid that section at first light now. Even without fog, even when the sun is up, I feel like something might be watching. I keep checking over my shoulder, keep my phone ready, but it's been weeks and nothing has returned. I don't know if it's gone for good or if it's just waiting for the right conditions. Sometimes, when the morning is quiet and there's a low mist over the valley, I swear I can feel the same presence, the same stillness pressing down, the way it did that morning. I haven't told many people because I don't have an explanation and I don't want to sound crazy. But every time I lace up my shoes and head up the trail, I think about that orb hovering through the fog and how the dogs knew to stop barking the instant it paused. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it's something natural or something else entirely. All I know is that the fog was thick, the air was still, and for a few minutes, the world felt like it had shifted just a little. Something else was there, just out of reach, and it noticed me. And that, more than anything, is what I remember. I started at Area 51 as a maintenance tech in late August. I'd done odd jobs at smaller installations before, but this was different. Even the roads leading in had a sense of isolation, empty deserts stretching for miles, and checkpoints that felt like they were more about keeping you from noticing things than stopping intruders. My first week was routine, cleaning filters, checking generators, making sure backup systems were online. Nothing unusual. At least, nothing I'd recognize yet. It was my second week when I was called to a section of the base I hadn't seen before. I was told by a supervisor, "Follow me. Don't stray, and don't talk about this." His tone wasn't casual. It was one of those quiet commands that made you feel like questioning wasn't an option. We walked past several hangars, past a series of tall, blank buildings with no signs. I noticed security cameras every few meters, but they didn't seem to be pointed at us as we passed. The desert outside was dark, just faintly lit by floodlights. There was a faint wind carrying sand across the gravel paths. The closer we got, the more I noticed a humming sound. Low, constant, like a generator, but different. Softer, almost alive. Finally, he stopped at a door I hadn't seen marked on any maps. "Here," he said. "Inside. You'll know what to do." He swiped a card, the door clicked, and it opened. The room was stark, small, maybe 20 by 30 feet, walls painted a flat white, but the lighting was off, too even, too soft, no shadows. Instruments lined the walls, small consoles with blinking lights, readouts I didn't recognize, screens that were dark but glowing faintly with a blue hue. I stepped in, my boots echoing on the floor. The hum grew slightly louder, but it didn't feel mechanical. It was constant, steady, resonant. like the room itself was vibrating. I started running through the checklist my supervisor had left me. I inspected a console, toggled switches, noted readings. The instruments responded, but not like anything I'd seen. Some of them flickered when I moved, as if sensing me. After a few minutes, I realized something. The room didn't match what cameras outside showed. I'd peeked at monitors near the door before entering, and all I'd seen was a blank storage room. No consoles, no lights, nothing, just a bare white room. I blinked, thinking I'd misread it, but when I glanced at the screens again, same thing, empty. I turned back to the room. It hadn't changed. The hum continued. I ran through the checklist again, noticing details I'd missed. Small vents along the floor, pulsing faintly. A panel in the corner that seemed to shimmer, almost like heat waves but colder. A faint scent of metal and ozone that wasn't unpleasant but felt artificial. After about 20 minutes, my supervisor returned. "You're done?" he asked. I nodded, trying not to sound nervous. "Good. Leave the way you came. Don't linger." I followed him back down the corridor, noticing that the hum faded immediately when I stepped out. The desert air outside smelled like dry sage and dust. Later, I checked security footage again. Nothing. The hallway outside showed me walking in, then nothing. No door opening, no shadow on the floor, just an empty hallway. I tried to tell Megan, a coworker, about it the next day. She laughed, thinking I was joking. "There's no lab there, Derek," she said. "We've checked. Nothing. Just storage. You sure you weren't half asleep?" I couldn't argue. I didn't have proof. All I had were my memories, the feeling of the hum, the way the instruments had reacted, and the sense that the room watched me. That first night, I kept tossing and turning. I kept imagining the soft lights flickering on, instruments reading things I couldn't understand, some presence just beyond the edge of perception. A few days later, I was assigned to that section again. I went in, half expecting to see the lab empty, or maybe not exist at all. But the door was there, locked. No card would open it. I called the supervisor. He brushed it off, said it was temporary lockdown. But the hum, the smell of metal and ozone, it stayed with me. I could almost feel it behind the walls, a quiet resonance beneath the base itself. I started noticing other anomalies in that area. Walkways that didn't match the base maps, lights flickering when no one was there. The occasional sense of being watched, like someone or something was tracking my steps in the shadows. I asked other workers. Most shrugged it off. Some claimed they'd seen odd rooms or corridors that weren't on any schematics, but no one seemed willing to describe them in detail. One night, I returned late after a long shift. The desert wind was strong, kicking up sand against the fences. I was alone, walking past that same section. The hum started again, faint but unmistakable. I froze. The door I'd entered before was slightly ajar, just a crack. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't, but I stepped closer. Inside, the room appeared as I remembered. Humming instruments, faint lights, shadows that didn't match the angles of the lamps. But this time, I noticed something else. On one console, a readout pulsed irregularly, almost like a heartbeat. I leaned closer. The numbers didn't make sense. Far too small, far too precise, like it was recording something I couldn't see. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become outside. The wind had stopped. The desert was still. The faint resonance of the room felt almost alive. I blinked. The console lights dimmed slightly as if reacting to me. I felt a cold shiver, a warning I didn't understand. I left, backing away slowly. Outside, the air smelled normal again, the wind returning, carrying dust and desert night. I glanced back once. The door was closed. No hum, no lights, nothing that anyone would recognize. Since then, I avoid that section when I can. But sometimes when I'm working late and the base is quiet, I swear I can hear it. The hum, faint, almost melodic, behind walls that shouldn't exist. I don't know what it is. I don't know why the instruments respond the way they do. But I remember the room, exactly as it was, and I know I saw something no one else is supposed to see. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still feel it watching. I was on the porch because the house felt too still inside. It had been one of those long days at the clinic. Back-to-back appointments, charts to fill out, the kind of small nagging errors that make you check a patient's name twice. I left my bag by the door, poured a glass of something iced and weak, and settled into the swing with a blanket over my knees. It was late May, warm enough that the nights hung soft, but cool enough that you wanted a little something over your legs. The porch light cast that familiar yellow pool over the steps. The rest of the yard dissolved into hedges and the big maple that leans toward the fence. At first, nothing was odd. The neighborhood was whispering. Somewhere a TV murmured through an open window. A distant car passed, a dog barked twice, and then went on with its night. The little radio on the kitchen counter had been set to low earlier, and its tinny voice floated out the back window for a bit, then faded as people turned off screens. I watch the sky because I do. It's a small ritual, a way to tell the day it's over. The moon was a sliver, and the first stars were pricking out like points on black velvet. I had Rosie, our old beagle, curled at my feet, nose tucked. She stirred sometimes and then settled. That's when the first small thing happened. The crickets that had been making a steady undercurrent of sound cut off. Not a fade out, more like someone snapped a hand over the band. One moment they were there, the next the yard felt like a room with the TV paused. I noticed it the way you notice when the refrigerator stops humming. It's such a minor absence it makes the whole house feel less certain. Rosie lifted her head and looked up at the maple, ears up in that anxious, listening way dogs have. She never did that without reason. I put my glass down and listened. For a while, there was nothing but the far highway and the faint thunk of a screen door down the block. I thought maybe wind had died away. That happens sometimes in the valleys. Little pockets of perfect stillness where the air holds. Then the porch bulb dimmed. Not a flicker or a pop. It softened like someone let the wattage down. The light pool across the steps thinned and a bar of the swing chair threw a longer shadow. I told myself the bulb was old and that I'd replace it in the morning. I told myself many small, sensible things that night. The porch light brightened again after a few heartbeats, steady and normal, and I settled back. A little later, the clock on the stove, the kind with green LED numbers, blipped. It jumped forward by 2 minutes, then back. The soundless tick of the kitchen clock settling felt oddly loud in a night that had lost its crickets. I picked up my phone to check the time. The screen showed a single bar, and the tiny circle of searching that means the network was on vacation. My thumb hovered over the screen like I might prod it back into life. Rosie gave a small bark at the maple and stood up. She padded to the edge of the porch and peered into the yard, tail not wagging, just tense. I went with her and leaned on the rail. The sky glittered. The maple's leaves were black cutouts against it. You could see Orion if you knew where to look. I know because I used to drag my kids out to the park and name the shapes. A single star on the left side of the sky caught my eye. It was one of those first bright ones, maybe a planet even. It hung steady and white. I watched it for no reason other than habit. And then the star brightened. Not slowly, not like the way light seems to bloom when cloud thins. It brightened fast. In the space of a breath, it went from a distant pin to something like a small, very distant bulb turned up to a glare. The change was instantaneous enough that it felt like a cut. The whole yard filled with a soft, pale light that wasn't warm the way porch light is. It was cool, almost silver. It flattened colors into a high-contrast sketch. Roses that had been coral took on a hard white edge. The grass showed each blade like the slats of a paintbrush. When the light hit us, I felt the hairs along my forearms stand up. The air didn't change temperature. If anything, it felt a degree thinner, like the night had been sipped. The light was not a beam. It didn't have a cone or a focused source. It was like the sky had decided to be a lamp, and the lamp had been set on the map of my yard. Shadows sharpened immediately. The house across the street, dark and shuttered, looked as if someone had taken a photograph and pushed the exposure. Even Rosie's eyes reflected the silver in a way I'd never seen. The first thought was practical. Someone with a flashlight on the hill, a sport camera, a spotlight from a truck. But the glow didn't move like any of those things. It didn't come from the road. It came from the sky, up where stars live. It wasn't a plane. I would have heard a motor or seen strobes. There was no sound beyond the distant highway and that small, tight noise of my chest. I called my name out because calling your own name is a thing you can do when the night stretches and you want someone else to witness it, to fold it into normal. Evan, I said, come here. My husband's voice floated from the kitchen window where he'd been fixing something sensible. He always tucks tools away by the sink, and when he answered, I could hear his feet on the tile. I said, "Outside! Now!" It was stupidly abrupt, and I knew it, but I wanted him there. By the time he came to the door, the light had eased. The star had returned to its ordinary pin, and the yard had the same gold puddle on the steps from the porch bulb. Evan stepped out, rubbing his hands like he was cold, though the air wasn't. "What?" he started. "The star," I said. "It lit up the whole yard." My voice sounded very small. I had the sense of saying something that would make him fold it into a sensible story. Some electrical blip, neighborhood prank, but the tremor in my hands made me honest. He looked up where I'd been looking and squinted. The pinprick of the star was there, innocent and wrong. "I don't see anything," he said after a second, like he might have missed the end of my sentence or the point altogether. He came closer and put an arm around my shoulders, the way he does when someone else is rattled. "You sure you didn't just catch lightning or a plane?" he asked. "No," I said. "It was bright. It lit everything, like daylight." I told him how the shadows had become sharp and how the roses looked white-edged. I told him Rosie had looked at the sky like she'd seen a person. He listened the way he always does, slow and available, and then, without meaning to sound unhelpful, he said, "Maybe your eyes were tired." We stood there in the cooling gold of the porch bulb, and I watched his face look for the practical thing. He was trying on reasons the same way someone tries on coats to see which fit. I wanted him to say, "I saw it too," because shared witnesses make events less slippery. But he didn't. He only said, "Want me to check the street?" And I said yes. He walked to the edge of the yard, down the path, and leaned over the low fence. The street was the same as always, a parked car near the lamppost, a silhouette of a man walking his dog farther down, the soft orange of sodium lights. He checked over his shoulder and then came back without looking alarmed. "Nothing odd," he said. He tried the radio in the kitchen, flipped through channels. The tiny blue LED on the stove blinked its clock, the same numbers as before, 11:43, and didn't stutter. The router's little light kept blinking its polite pattern. My phone, which had shown 1 bar, came back to full signal as if the world had never been absent for a second. The porch bulb held steady. The sky, to everything else, behaved like an old friend. I kept thinking about the light while he made us tea. I kept replaying that instant where the yard went from ordinary to near daylight, and how the roses looked like they'd been sketched in white. I felt silly and small for being thrown by a blink of brightness, but a part of me had been unsettled in a way I couldn't name. The ordinary things of the house, mug handle, tea steam, the soft ticking of the clock, were a small, precise proof that the world had not ended, not even a little. We didn't tell anyone. Who would you tell? I thought of calling the neighbor who charts weather out of habit. I thought of the city police or an astronomer at the university, and then the practical pile formed again. You have patients in the morning, bills, a child's rehearsal. The list of what must be done shrank the night down to normal size. I wrote a note and left it in my phone. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. No details, just a stub of evidence. That night I woke twice and went to the window because habit is an odd form of superstitious logic. The sky was the same as it had been before. Stars, moon bit in a sliver. Rosie slept in her crate, lungs slow and steady. The next evening, the news was full of a local council meeting about zoning, nothing about lights or sky phenomena. The week after that, I walked the yard in daylight and looked for any scorch on the grass, a melted leaf, anything to explain the intensity of the brightness. There was nothing unusual, just the ordinary tracks of the sprinklers and the faint ring where a bird had pecked last week. Sometimes I caught myself staring up, waiting for the star to flare like a hand turning a switch. I kept expecting some repeat, a pattern, a reason. Life resumed its usual steady sequence: work, dinner, the town routine. The note on my phone sat there like a small relic. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. I read it sometimes, like reading an odd sentence someone else had written about the world. I don't have a tidy explanation. I only have the memory of that sudden high white light, the way it sharpened shadows and flattened color, and the fact that by the time Evan reached the porch, the sky had closed its mouth and resumed the business of being night. The garden looked the same as it always had, the roses no paler than before, and the maple's leaves resumed being nothing more than leaves against the sky. The event folded itself into the night with the quiet persistence of some things that don't need telling. It was a Thursday night run, late summer, middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. I was working for a regional courier company, mostly delivering auto parts to repair shops after hours. My route usually took me through a mix of back roads and small towns, quiet stretches where the only light came from my headlights and the occasional farmhouse porch. That night was uneventful until around 11. I just dropped off at a shop outside Millbrook and was cutting across Old Quarry Road to get to the next town. That's when I passed the house the first time. It was an old farmhouse, 2 stories, paint peeling on the siding, the kind of place you notice because it looks stuck in another decade. No lights on inside, no porch light, no yard light. The fields around it were dark too. I didn't think much of it. Half the houses along that road were empty or used as storage barns. I kept driving, following the GPS through turns I'd taken a dozen times before. But about 20 minutes later, after looping around the back roads, I came up to that same farmhouse again. I actually slowed down because it didn't make sense. My GPS showed I was on County Line Road, not Old Quarry. But there it was, the same tilted mailbox, same cracked driveway, same sagging porch swing. It was like I'd circled without realizing it, even though the route shouldn't have brought me back there. As I passed it the second time, something caught my eye. The roofline looked wrong. It wasn't brighter like a normal light inside turning on. It was more like the entire outline of the roof glowed faintly, as if something above it was casting a pale, even light straight down. It didn't flicker, didn't shift. Just this faint glow, barely strong enough to make out the shingles. And it wasn't coming from inside. No windows lit up, no porch, just the roof glowing. I slowed almost to a crawl, staring at it through the windshield. The fields around the house were pitch black, no stars overhead thanks to the cloud cover. I couldn't see anything above it. No aircraft lights, no beam, nothing. Just the roof itself glowing softly for maybe 5 or 6 seconds. Then it went completely dark again. Not faded, just off, like a switch had been thrown. The house was a black shape against the night again, no different from the first time I'd passed it. I didn't stop. My foot pressed harder on the gas without me deciding. The truck rattled as I sped up, gravel spitting from the tires. When I glanced in the mirror, there was nothing but my taillights reflecting off the road. For the next half hour, I kept checking the GPS, trying to reassure myself I was where I was supposed to be. The map looked normal, the road names matched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been pushed off my usual loop somehow. At my next drop, I nearly dropped the keys, pulling them from the night box. My hands were shaking, and I had to stand there breathing for a minute before I could get back in the cab. On the way home, I rerouted completely to avoid that stretch. Even so, the whole drive, I felt like the sky above me was too heavy, like something was following along just out of sight. When I finally parked the truck back at the depot, I shut the engine off and just sat there. The silence pressed in, no glow, no sound, nothing unusual, just a normal night. Except I can still picture that house, black as coal one second, the roof glowing faint and wrong the next. And I never passed it again on that route, even though the GPS swore I should have. I got to the dock before dawn because that's when the lake felt like it belonged to me. The town was still asleep, houses dark and shuttered, and the air had that wet, cold feel it gets when fog has been sitting on the water all night. I carried the little Coleman cooler and my rod across the planks, boots thumping hollow. There was a thin sound, my breath, the creak of old wood, and nothing else for a while. I liked that silence. It tuned out the week I'd had and left room for nothing but the lake. I had been coming out here for years. Not a big operation, just me, a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and some night crawlers. The dock was the kind that sagged in the middle, the boards bleached and salted from storms, the pilings black with algae. The light on the post clicked on because that's what it did at first light, a weak bulb that threw a small halo in the mist. I sat, set up my line, and let the bobber drift out past the pilings. At first, everything was ordinary. The bobber sat there like a little star, no bites, the rod resting across my knees. The fog made the world hush. It swallowed sound and softened edges. A distant gull called once, then nothing. I drank coffee that tasted like the road and stared out, the way you do when you're waiting for a bite or trying to think straight. Something else felt off before I actually saw it. The surface of the water was too smooth. Even when I had had still mornings before, there was usually a skitter, an insect, a fish feeding shallow, the wake of a passing canoe. That morning the lake was glassed over, so flat it looked like a sheet of black glass. I remember thinking that it was beautiful and wrong at the same time. Then I saw the reflection. It wasn't a reflection of the sky. It lay on the surface like a coin placed on a table. Round, pale, a soft light that moved with astonishing slowness just under the skin of the water. If you had been standing next to me, you'd have seen the lake look like it had a small moon rolling under the surface, the light diffused and calm. It hovered maybe 10 feet from the dock and made a circle about the size of a dinner plate. The rings where it touched the water weren't ripples. They were the faintest suggestion of a disturbance, like someone had pressed a fingertip to gel. I leaned forward without thinking, the way you do when a strange animal walks into the yard. The closer I got, the clearer it became that this light wasn't a trick of fog. When I bent down, the wood of the dock creaked, and the light pulsed almost imperceptibly, like it was responding to the movement in the world above. It didn't reflect anything I knew. No moon, no lamplight, no glow from the town. It was inside the water and not on it at the same time. I reached out my hand, not to touch because there was a small voice in me that said, "Don't," but to steady myself on the railing. The air near the surface felt a degree colder than the air a foot back. When I put my hand over the spot, the skin on my fingers prickled, like the tiny static shiver you get before a storm. The light stayed, steady as if I held my breath for it. Something rubbed my ankle. It was only a small fish, startled maybe, because I had my paddle resting near the pilings and it bumped the line. My bobber jerked and then settled. I thought for a second that the little disturbance had moved the light. But when I looked back, the circle had slid half a foot to the left, deliberately, as if something under the surface was nudging itself along the plane. Not random, not like the frenzied flick of a bait fish. It moved smooth and slow. I took out my phone, the reflex of a man who wants a record of oddness. The screen flashed awake and the camera app opened, but the image on the screen was just fog and black water. When I pointed it at the glow, the light didn't register. The phone gave me a pale smear, like the camera couldn't reconcile the fog and the glow together. I snapped a picture anyway. It saved. Then in the gallery, the photo showed nothing but a gray blur. I deleted it because even the act of saving made me feel ridiculous. The thing under the water didn't make a sound. No bubbling, no plop, nothing that usually goes with movement in a liquid. It was silent like a ghost. I kept watching it and kept thinking up explanations. Some bioluminescent critter, reflections from a passing boat. But later that morning when the fog lifted and the first fisherman came out, the water around the dock looked ordinary as an old tire. No algae bloom, no jelly, no lights of any kind. The glow moved again, and this time it rose. It didn't leap or shoot. It lifted slow like someone easing a balloon away. The light slid upward through the fog in a soft column until the fog swallowed it and it vanished. There was no splash, no sound. For a moment, the surface of the lake stayed as placid as before, as if nothing had been there at all. The thermos in my lap seemed too loud in that pause. I stayed there for a long time after it disappeared. My coffee went cold. Crows started to argue in the trees, and a pickup puttered down the access road toward the launch. I tried to tell myself it was some natural phenomenon that had an ordinary name, but the plain fit didn't come. A fisherman arrived with his son, smiling and loud. He set up a rod 2 slips down and cracked a plastic chair. He asked me if I'd been getting anything, and I told him a half-truth. No, nothing, and he laughed and said, "Rough night?" Like that explained everything. The compulsion was to go back to sleep or to the town and forget it, but I found I couldn't. I packed up slowly, rolled my line, and checked the knots. The dock looked the same in broad sight. The algae on the pilings, the slick where rain had run, the way gulls made a mess on the rail. Up top, the world was as it always was on the lake. a dog-barked morning starting over. The oddness felt small and precise, tucked into the seam where water met air. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store. I bought a new bulb for the dock light because it had been flickering the week before, and I figured I could fix that routine thing. The clerk, a man named Pete, who'd been a fisherman his whole life, asked how the morning had been, and I left out the glowing circle and the way it rose into fog. I told him about the weather and how calm the water had been. He nodded because that's what people who work with lakes do. They catalog conditions. He said, sometimes the lake does tricks, and I chalked it up to him keeping his mouth open for a conversation. That afternoon, I tugged on a beer and sat on the back steps, watching the lake through the haze of heat. The sun had burned most of the fog away, and the dock was bright and ordinary. Kids were diving off the far buoy, and the oars of a canoe cut neat white trails across the lake. All the ordinary things seemed to be patting the memory down so it wouldn't roll. I read a page of a book and kept checking the window like a child. I didn't go back out for a week. I kept my tackle box in the garage and the rod leaning against the wall, both of them angular with use. I called the friend who runs the bait shop and asked if anyone had reported anything weird. He snorted and said no one had said anything about ghost lights. He laughed at me for a minute, but I heard a note in his voice, a small hesitation, as if he decided not to dismiss me outright. When I finally went back to the dock, it was late and empty, and the light on the post hissed to life like it always did. I sat where I had before, the wood warm from the day, and cast out less to fish than to see the place with my presence. The lake was its usual mirror, flicked now and then by carp or breeze, and I felt a little foolish for being afraid the water would show me something odd again. Nothing did. The night folded itself into itself normally. I packed up at first light with no stories but the one I'd been keeping in my own head. At breakfast, I told my wife about the stillness and how perfect the lake had been. She said the word beautiful like it was a blank check and left it at that. I didn't tell her about reaching out with my hand or about the way the light slid into the fog like it was moving up a ladder. There are things that happen on water that people accept without comment. Sudden squalls, strange runs of fish, the way a breeze can arrive like a percussionist. This wasn't one of those things I could put a label on and set in the proper drawer. It was a small private event the lake seemed to have made for no audience. I keep my rod where it belongs, and I still go out sometimes when the weather's right. I fish for the quiet and the chance to be alone with the water. If the light ever comes back, I'll be there. If it doesn't, I'll tell the same story the next time someone asks how the morning went. The lake was flat, and everything felt like it was listening. Then I'll shrug and pour another cup of coffee, because that's what you do when something odd passes through the life you live and leaves you with the simplest trace of it. A small, inexplicable memory that sits in your pocket like a smooth stone. I was crouched behind a fallen oak, the early evening fog settling in low between the pines when I first saw it. A pale, pulsing glow, weaving between the trees maybe 100 yards out. I froze, barely breathing, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and my own heartbeat. The light didn't move like a person walking or a flashlight beam. It danced, weaving in smooth curves, sometimes slowing, sometimes speeding up, never touching the ground. At first, I thought it might be another hunter. Someone out too late, maybe with a small lantern, but the motion didn't match anything human. It slipped silently through the woods, no crunch of twigs or brush, just this soft, almost liquid glow. I tried to track it with my eyes, adjusting my position to get a better look, but the fog made everything blurry. I lifted my rifle slowly, scope first, trying to get a closer view. That's when it vanished. One moment it was there, weaving just above the underbrush. The next, nothing. The space it had occupied seemed empty, but the fog hung heavy and my pulse started to hammer against my ribs. I lowered the rifle, scanning in a tight circle, ears straining for anything unusual. For a minute, nothing. Then I noticed the sound, or maybe the lack of it. All the usual forest noises had gone quiet. Birds that normally called as the sun set, frogs along the creek, even the wind through the pine needles, all gone. complete silence, heavier than any night I'd ever spent out here. I felt exposed, like I was the only living thing in a still painting. I moved slowly, rifle raised, trying to get closer to where I'd last seen the glow. As I stepped over a root, a small flicker caught my eye. Just a glint of white light bouncing off something wet on a branch. I froze, trying to make sense of it, then realized it wasn't the same as before. It was static. A reflection maybe, but it made the hairs on my neck stand up. I kept moving, careful to stay in the shadows, following the direction I thought the light had gone. After 10 minutes, I stumbled onto a clearing. Nothing but fog and pines, and my flashlight beam cutting a narrow swath in front of me. I checked my watch. About 20 minutes had passed since I first saw the glow. That seemed off. I could have sworn only a few minutes had gone by, but the sky had darkened further, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I leaned against a tree, trying to calm myself, when I noticed something odd. Tiny points of light, almost like embers, flickered in the fog ahead. They weren't moving like fireflies. They stayed in place, then blinked out one by one. I counted 3 before my flashlight battery buzzed low and dimmed, forcing me to switch it to a weaker setting. That's when I felt it. Not behind me, not to the side, but a sense of being watched. Nothing I could see, just awareness, as if something was tracking my movements carefully. I adjusted my grip on the rifle, feeling the weight of it steady my nerves, and started moving back toward the path. As I did, the fog thickened unnaturally, and the faint pulsing light reappeared for a brief second between 2 thick pines. I froze, scope up again, but as soon as I tried to focus, it vanished. The silence pressed in closer, and I realized I couldn't hear even the usual nighttime creaks of the forest floor under my own boots. I kept walking, slow, deliberate, staying alert. My mind raced through explanations. A strange reflection of the moon, bioluminescent insects, some kind of trick of fog and branches, but none of it fit. The way the light had moved, the absence of sound, the pressure of being watched. All wrong for anything natural, I knew. By the time I got back to the main logging trail, I was shaking, but I told myself to stay rational. Maybe someone else was out here with a laser pointer or some toy. Maybe I just imagined parts of it, my eyes playing tricks in the fog. I even laughed quietly to myself, trying to break the tension. I kept checking behind me as I hiked back to the truck. Everything looked normal, shadows long and straight, fog thick but ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the light, whatever it was, had followed me in some way. I slowed every time a branch snapped underfoot, listening, expecting, but nothing. The truck came into view, headlights dim in the fog. I approached cautiously, scanning the tree line one last time. Nothing moved. I unlocked the door and got inside, leaving the engine off at first, just listening. The silence outside pressed against the glass, heavy and deliberate, like the woods were holding their breath. When I started the engine, the vibration of the idling motor seemed loud in contrast to the quiet. I looked in the rearview mirror at the fog-shrouded trees and couldn't see a thing, but I had the sensation that the glow was still out there somewhere, just beyond the edge of my vision. Driving out of the woods, I kept glancing at the side mirrors and over the roof, half expecting to see it again, weaving between the trees. But the path back was empty, the fog thinning, the forest returning to ordinary sounds. Birds called from the treetops, a distant branch cracked, a small owl hooted, normal again. When I reached my driveway, headlights cutting a path across the snow-dusted yard, I hesitated before stepping inside. My dog barked from the living room, breaking the tension, and I laughed, though it was shaky. I told myself it was just the fog, the fatigue, maybe a mix of imagination and stress from a long day hunting. I still think about it. Sometimes when I'm hiking, or even just sitting on the porch, I swear I see a flicker in the woods, subtle, just at the edge of sight. Not constant, not obvious, but enough to make me glance over my shoulder and feel that same watchful pressure. I've gone back to the woods since then. I bring a friend sometimes, lights, radios, even extra rifles. Nothing shows up in the same way. The fog is normal, the trees sound like themselves, and I feel almost foolish remembering that night. But every so often, in the right misty conditions, I catch a pulse of white moving against the dark trunks and my stomach tightens. And I know, in a way I can't explain, that whatever it was, it's still out there, weaving silently through the trees. I was finishing my last delivery for the night, the kind where everything's quiet, except the hum of the van's engine and the faint buzz of neon signs in the distance. It was just past 11 p.m., and the streets of Cedar Ridge were empty, the kind of empty that makes you notice every little sound, a dog barking 3 blocks away, the scrape of a loose shutter in the wind. I'd done this route enough times that I knew every turn and shortcut without thinking. I pulled into the lot for the last house, an older duplex with peeling paint and a single dim porch light. The van's headlights washed over the driveway, and as I cut the engine, every other exterior light on the street, lamps on poles, security lights, a few from the houses themselves, flickered once in unison. Just a quick dip and back on. I blinked. I muttered something under my breath. Great, power surge or something. But as I stepped out, I noticed it. A soft hum in the air. Not mechanical, not from my van, nothing I could place. It wasn't loud, just low enough that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced up, thinking maybe one of the streetlights had been oscillating strangely, or some transformer down the block was acting up. That's when I saw it. A dim, oval-shaped glow hovered over the trees at the end of the street. Pale, bluish-white, just enough light to make it visible through the thin mist that had rolled in overnight. It moved slowly, almost lazily, in a way that made no sense. It wasn't following the road. It wasn't stationary. It just drifted above the tree line, calm, deliberate. I froze, my hands gripping the package I was supposed to deliver. The hum grew a fraction louder, almost imperceptibly, like the air itself had thickened around me. My brain tried to rationalize. A drone? But I hadn't seen anything like it. No blinking lights, no shape. It was a glow, smooth, uniform, not mechanical. I stepped back toward the van, heart racing, and the glow tilted slightly, moving along the street at a pace that felt off. I squinted, and it seemed to pause whenever I blinked or shifted my gaze. The hum never stopped. I reached for my phone to grab a picture, and the glow dimmed as if sensing the motion. It wasn't gone entirely, but it faded just enough that my camera couldn't pick it up properly. I lowered the phone and watched as it drifted toward the far edge of the trees and vanished completely. No fade into the sky, no movement behind the clouds, just gone. I stood there for a long moment, the hum gone, the lights normal, the street entirely silent again. My hands were trembling, and I realized I hadn't even breathed for a while. Shaking, I got back into the van. The engine started smoothly, no hiccups, no interference, nothing that suggested anything abnormal had occurred except for my own nerves. I drove slowly down the street, glancing up at the tree line again. Nothing. Every house was dark, every lamp steady. The neighborhood was ordinary again. On the way back to the depot, my mind replayed the event over and over. The synchronization of the lights, the hum, the slow drift of that glow, it all made sense in no logical way. I thought about stopping at a gas station to tell someone, anyone, but I realized there'd be no evidence. No trail, no video, no drone or drone pilot to question. Just me. I kept thinking I'd missed something. Maybe there was a plane behind the clouds? No, too slow, too deliberate. A weather balloon? Could be. Except of all the nights I've driven these streets, I'd never seen one behave like that, and the glow didn't move with the wind. By the time I reached the depot, the sun was starting to push light across the horizon. The event was hours ago in real time, but it felt like it had stretched out, moments dragging one after another. I parked the van, took a deep breath, and tried to shake it off. Later, I told my supervisor, half laughing, trying to sound casual. He nodded, said maybe a transformer or a low cloud catching city lights. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to. But I could still feel it, the hum vibrating faintly in my chest like an echo left behind by something that shouldn't exist. That night, on the drive home, I found myself looking up at the sky more than the road. Every flicker of light in the distance made me check instinctively. Every shadow along the tree line made me tense. I didn't see the glow again, but I could feel the memory of it, the way it hovered silently, completely indifferent to me or my van. I parked at home and sat in the driveway for a while. The neighborhood was quiet, normal. No hum, no flickering lights, no pale glow drifting across the sky. I finally got out, leaned against the van, and let the cold air settle on me. I couldn't explain it. Nothing about it fit with anything I knew. And yet, it happened. I've made deliveries in that area dozens of times before and since. I've seen fog, power blips, strange reflections, you name it, none of them compare. Every time the night is still, I find myself glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see that soft oval of light drifting slowly, moving in ways that no earthly thing should. I don't tell anyone else about it anymore. You can't. People would laugh or shake their heads. But I remember every flicker of lights, every soft hum, every impossibly slow drift of that glow. It was real, in a way that doesn't fit into the world we think we know, and the quiet that followed it, that, I think, haunts me more than the glow itself. I was leaving my shift at the warehouse later than usual that night. The sky was clear, but the air had that heavy, damp feel that always comes after a week of light rain. My old Honda was humming along the two-lane back road that winds through the outskirts of Danville, and I was half listening to the radio, half worrying about whether I'd remembered to lock the front door at home. About 10 minutes in, I noticed it, a pale light hovering behind me in my rearview mirror. At first, I assumed it was another car. Headlights catching on something, but the thing wasn't moving like a car. No approach, no dimming, no shift in angle as I adjusted speed. Just there. A steady white glow about the size of a basketball in my mirror. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, even adjusted the mirror, thinking maybe it was just a reflection from the dashboard or a street light behind me. Nothing changed. The light stayed, hovering there. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a plane, but planes make sound, and even small private planes leave those little blinking red and green navigation lights. This wasn't blinking, no sound, just that smooth, unwavering glow. I increased my speed slightly, figuring it would either pull away or reveal itself as something normal. It stayed. I slowed down. It stayed. The more I drove, the more my stomach sank into a tight knot. It felt deliberate, like it was pacing me. About 15 minutes in, I passed a little turnoff, a patch of old gravel where I sometimes pull over if traffic is heavy or if I just need a breather. I thought about stopping there, but part of me worried that if I did, I'd have to confront whatever it was directly. So I kept driving. The orb stayed exactly the same distance behind me, always centered in the mirror. I glanced at my speedometer and headlights, tried adjusting the wipers, even though it hadn't rained in hours, just to break the pattern in my mind. Every time I thought I caught a glimpse of the road behind it, it didn't make sense. There were no trees, no roadside signs reflecting light off it, nothing that could explain how it was floating in the air like that. 20 minutes. I kept timing it in my head. My usual commute is 30 minutes from the warehouse to my apartment, but this stretch of road is usually quiet. That night, though, I couldn't hear a single car coming the other way. No trucks, no motorcycles, nothing. Only the soft hum of my engine and the occasional creak of the old tires on asphalt. I started talking to myself, quietly at first, then louder when I realized my voice was the only thing that might remind me I was alone. It's just a streetlight. It's just a streetlight, I kept repeating. But I knew it wasn't. I reached the last sharp curve before the bridge that crosses the river, a section of road where trees arch overhead and the road narrows. I decided I couldn't drive any longer with that thing behind me. My hands were gripping the wheel tight enough to leave marks. I signaled and pulled onto the gravel shoulder, heart thumping. The moment I killed the engine, the glow vanished, like it had never been there. No trail of light fading into the distance, just the dark, quiet road and the sound of my own shallow breathing. I sat for a few minutes, staring into the tree line across the road. The fog from earlier was rolling in now, thin and low over the river, turning the trees into shifting gray silhouettes. Nothing moved. No lights, no reflections, nothing. I tried to convince myself it had been headlights catching the mist, or maybe a plane that had banked out of view, but something about it had felt aware. I wasn't imagining a light. I wasn't imagining it following me. And it hadn't just disappeared because I stopped. That glow had moved with me the entire way, maintaining the same distance, the same shape, the same intensity. I finally started the car again and drove slowly over the bridge, keeping my eyes on the mirror. Nothing. Not a flicker, not a shimmer, nothing. The rest of the commute home felt normal, if tense. My usual left turn onto Maple Street seemed longer than usual. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting it to be waiting for me at the corner. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly like it always did. Quiet, dark, empty. I left the engine running a few seconds longer just to reassure myself. No light, no presence, just silence. I killed the engine, locked the doors, and sat for a moment, gripping the wheel. Inside, I flicked on every light, checked the locks again, paced a little. I even looked out the window toward the road, hoping to catch a hint of movement. Nothing. The street was still. The fog was thicker now, curling along the pavement like smoke, hiding the trees and the river behind a gray curtain. I tried to sleep that night, but I kept seeing it in my mind's eye. That glowing orb, floating steadily, following me, observing. I don't know why it stayed for 20 minutes, and I don't know why it vanished the instant I stopped. The next morning, I drove to work and kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting it to reappear. Nothing, just cars, the occasional jogger, and the early sun reflecting off wet pavement. I haven't seen anything like it since. Not in the city lights, not on any country roads. But sometimes when I leave work late and the fog rolls in low over the pavement, I catch a flicker in the rearview mirror that makes me hesitate, my stomach tightening. And for a moment I swear I see that pale glow hovering behind me, pacing silently, always keeping its distance. I found it the moment I lifted the print from the tray. We'd run the parade pictures through the Times little darkroom that Sunday evening because Earl Jensen, who shoots everything from town council fights to the high school football team, would want a fresh set for Monday's front page. I lowered the print into the fixer, counted strokes with the tongs like I always did, and then I pulled it up and held it to the red lamp. There, in the corner above the floats and the bunting and the mayor's hat mid-flight, was a perfect silver disc. It wasn't a smear or a crease. It was round, clean, a tiny coin of brightness caught over Main Street, high above the band. My first thought was a pinhole in the enlarger or a bit of dust on the negative, so I set the print aside and ran the negative on a contact sheet. The same shape showed up on the negative, black on clear, where the sky should have been blank. Earl swore he hadn't seen a thing when he took the shot. He remembered the crowd and the clowns and that Mrs. Pennington's float had lost its skirt on the last block. No mention of anything in the sky. The town had been a little odd for a week before the parade, little things that everyone passed off. The clock in the courthouse tower had stopped for a few minutes one Thursday morning. When it started again, it was a minute fast and nobody could say why. The milkman swore his horse had stood staring at nothing at the edge of the Benson field for an hour, head high, ears tight. On Friday evening, the radio in the barber shop filled with a high whining note that made the razors vibrate. Old Mr. Hargreaves swore he'd heard it, and when I went by the shop later, the mirrors held a ring of condensation like someone had breathed on them. None of that seemed connected until Sunday. The parade was full of the usual. Veterans in caps, a school band that played better than they ever do under pressure. Children with cotton candy, afloat with a lot more hay than anchors. The sky had been clear and blue, nothing to warn you off. Still, people made little jokes afterward about 50 years of tradition and a new trick. Someone said the lights at the soda fountain had dimmed when the band hit the cornet solo. A girl at the bakery swore her sister's compass spun for a second when they stood in the square. We were all saying small things like that because it made them sensible and laughable. I took the contact sheet back to Earl and we compared negatives under a loupe. The camera was a speed graphic he'd had since the war. He'd cleaned the lens that morning and the shutter was the same it always was. The disc appeared only in that single frame, not in the ones before or after, though Earl had fired the camera half a dozen times as the mayor waved. We examined the film for scratches, for a double exposure, for any sign of tampering. There were none. The density on the negative where the disc was matched a solid object, not a flare or a scratch. Lens flare, maybe, Earl said finally, but his voice was too quick. He'd put a lot of pride in his eyes. It sat on him wrong to be puzzled. I ran the print again in different paper stock, adjusted the contrast, held it up to the window in the newsroom where the light was honest. The disc was there every time, round and unobtrusive, and wrong. The editor, Martin Klein, asked me to hang one on the proof board so he could decide if it was front page material. We published it above the fold with the headline about the parade and a picture credit to Earl. I expected the phone to start ringing, people to call in and tell us they'd seen nothing but rain or the mayor's dog. Instead, the newsroom stayed oddly quiet. The strangest part was what happened after the paper hit the street. Folks came by to buy copies and flip the page, and almost everyone I spoke to remembered the parade, who'd waved, who'd missed the march, but no one remembered a disc in the sky. Lillian, who runs the post office, laughed and said, "You city boys, always spotting something." Joe Carver, who'd been standing on the corner selling hot dogs, watched the picture with the paper limp in his hand and said, "Flat, I don't see it." When I asked, "You weren't watching the sky then?" he shrugged. "I was watching the float with the goats," he said. "You think I would miss something like that?" Earl's cousin snapped a roll of amateur shots from the courthouse roof, the very place where, if anything had been in the sky, someone might have seen it head on. When the cousin came in with his prints the next day, the disc wasn't in any of them. Neither was it in the photo taken by a traveling photographer who'd been selling portrait sittings on the sidewalk. We scavenged every camera in town. Kids Brownies, the high school yearbook photographer, Mr. Klein's son who'd come by for a free copy, and on every sheet the sky was the ordinary blue it had been that day. Rumors spread in the manner of rumors, slowly at first, then with the kind of insistence only a small town can muster. Somebody swore a man in a gray suit had been watching the parade from a second-story window and had smiled like someone who knew something. Nobody could agree on which building. A woman at the library said the church bell had rung once by itself in the afternoon. The feed store's radio played white noise for a minute and then came back with the noon program as if it had been unbothered. People remember these things and flatten them down because life needs seams to hold. I kept staring at the print. I started to feel like it had been printed for me alone, like a private note folded into the public paper. I sent the negative to a man in Columbus who runs a lab. He was polite and thorough, and he called me a week later to say he'd found nothing wrong with the emulsion or the development. "No splice, no tamper, Harold," he said over the line like a man reading instructions. "Looks genuine to me." He wouldn't offer why it might have been there. There were other small oddities after that. My grandfather's pocket watch, which had run obediently for 30 years, skipped a beat the next morning and then went on. Mrs. Pennington told me her front yard lamp flickered when she walked past, though the bulb was new. Once, as I was locking up the office, the neon sign above the barber's slit an extra second of buzz and then hummed on steady. People came into the shop and asked in whispers whether the Times had staged some trick to sell papers. I'm not a man to court attention that way, and Martin was less interested in spectacle than in a full report, but the idea settled in like a nettle. Earl started to keep a small diary after the paper ran. He wrote down the times he'd left the house where he'd been, what the sky had looked like when he passed certain blocks. He photographed the courthouse roof at different hours for a week. We took the contact sheet and held it under different lamps and compared densities and grain. Every technical avenue ran into the same blank wall. The disc was on that frame, and that frame alone. I went downtown and asked folks if they had seen anything in the sky, any little gleam or movement, and they blinked and said no. And then they looked at each other as if maybe they didn't want to add anything to what the paper had said. Small towns have their ways of erasing oddness. If nobody mentions it, perhaps it never happened. That may be how people keep the world tidy. A month later, someone from the state paper called. They wanted the story. They wanted the negative. Martin refused to sell. He said a paper's job is to ask and to print what it finds. He was old in the way editors are old, careful with facts and harder on his conscience. "We ran it," he said. "We did our job." We kept the negative in the safe behind the desk. Life moved on. The 4th came and went, and we printed fireworks pictures. Earl kept shooting. Sometimes he complained about the odd frame and then laughed and moved on. Folks who'd bought the paper that day still put it on their mantles. A few of the older men said the disc might have been a balloon, that others a trick of light, and anyone with a head for work shrugged it into the day's oddities. The county clerk told me the state police had no record of anything in the sky that day, and their airplanes, if they had been up, would have been noted. Every so often, someone would come in and glance at the framed front page on the wall behind my desk. "Did you really see that?" they'd ask, not wanting to embarrass themselves. I would hand them a fresh cup of coffee and tell them what I knew. The negative in the safe, Earl's clean shutter, the contact printed on the paper that morning. They'd nod and put the cup down politely and then change the subject. I could tell they wanted to keep their day unruffled. I do not know what the disc was. I do not have a theory that fits all the little facts: the stopped clock, the radio hiss, the horse that wouldn't move. All I have is that one clean image in the corner of a page, and the memory of standing under the red lamp, holding the print, thinking the sky had been far older for a second than the town was ready to admit. I hung the print in the back of the office where the light is steady and the paper dry. People come by, look at it, and some of them ask me why I left it there. I tell them, half in jest, that a picture is a good thing to keep, whether it explains itself or not. Then I go back to the proofs, the obituaries, the town council minutes, and I do the work of the morning paper because bills don't wait for wonder. The disc stays, round and small in the corner, waiting like any ordinary photograph waits to be noticed again. I woke up to the sound of Rusty whining. At first, I thought it was just a dream. It was around 2 a.m., and my bedroom clock glowed 2:03 in red digits, but the whining didn't stop. Then came the scratching at the door, sharp, urgent, like he was trying to get me to move. I rubbed my eyes, sat up, and listened. My little golden retriever never does this. He's usually content sleeping at my feet. I slid out of bed by pulling on a sweatshirt and bare feet on the cold hardwood. The house was silent apart from Rusty, whose whining had risen to a soft bark. I called his name. "Rusty, what is it?" The sound didn't answer me, but it kept him at the door. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the back door. The air hit me immediately, humid, damp, still. I live in a small house on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, and the backyard backs up to some wooded lots that stretch for a mile or more. Normally, nights like this are dark, almost pitch black once you pass the porch light. But the backyard wasn't dark. It was lit in this pale, almost white glow. Not bright like a floodlight, not warm like a lamp, just pale, diffuse light that covered the yard in a soft haze. It didn't have a source that I could see. No lamp, no moon reflecting oddly on the clouds, nothing. Just the glow, casting shadows from the trees, the fence, even Rusty standing at my feet. I froze, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. Rusty barked once, then sat, staring into the yard. The air smelled different too. Not bad, exactly, just sharp, almost sour, metallic. I stepped onto the grass, barefoot, and the dew was wet, cold. My hands shook. "Hello?" I called, voice trembling, though there was no reason to expect an answer. The glow didn't pulse or flicker, it just hung there, still, like it was waiting for something. Rusty's ears were up, alert, and I noticed he was tense, body low, tail stiff. I lifted the flashlight and swept it across the yard. Nothing moved except the light catching on the dew on the grass. And then, when I spoke Rusty's name again, the glow began to fade, almost like it was aware of me calling out. I froze in the half-light, my breath visible in the cold night air, watching it dissolve into the darkness. Within a few seconds, it was gone. The backyard was normal again, the trees dark, the fence just a black line in the night, and Rusty sniffing the air, ears still pricked. I stayed there a long time, just standing, waiting for it to return. Nothing. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe a reflection from the streetlights a mile away, maybe the moon hitting a thin layer of fog. But the air had felt different, thicker somehow, with a low vibration I could feel in my chest. And Rusty, usually unbothered by lights or shadows, had acted like something was there that he couldn't ignore. I finally went back inside, but I left the back door open, just a crack. Rusty stayed at the threshold, watching. I brewed some coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and kept listening. Every little sound in the neighborhood seemed sharper, the rustle of leaves, the far-off bark of another dog, but no glow returned. By the time morning came, I had almost convinced myself it had been a trick of the mind. The dew sparkled in the sunlight, the backyard looked completely normal, Rusty lay on the rug in the living room, snoring softly. But even with daylight, I could still feel it in my chest. That same low, strange vibration, like the night had shifted for a moment into something else, something I didn't understand. Later, I checked my neighbors' houses. Nobody had seen anything. No lights in the sky, no unusual sounds, no glowing backyards. Just me and Rusty, standing in the yard with a memory of something that wasn't supposed to be there. I haven't seen it since. I've checked the yard on other late nights, kept the porch light on, even called Rusty's name into the dark. Nothing. But sometimes, when the air is heavy and the night is still, I swear I feel that same tension, that same hum in the chest, like the glow could return at any moment. I tried talking to a friend about it once, someone who's been into hiking and night photography. She said sometimes the atmosphere can catch light in strange ways, make the fog glow, make the dew shimmer, but it wasn't like that. There was nothing to bounce light off of. It was just there and gone. Rusty is fine. He doesn't act scared anymore, though I notice him staring at the backyard sometimes long after I've gone inside. And me? I check the yard sometimes before bed, but I don't wait outside anymore. I just remember it. The pale glow, the smell in the air, and that odd feeling that something had been there, watching us, then leaving as soon as I spoke. We were halfway through the third pull on the span when the rain stopped, like someone had shut off a faucet. Name's Ryan. I work for County Electric. Been a lineman for 12 years. That night, a cell had tracked in quick, heavy, fast-moving, the kind you watch on the scanner and know the phones at the office will start ringing. Around midnight, we got the report. A feeder had tripped somewhere between pole 47 and the substation. No houses down, just a big strip of rural line and a couple of farms. We loaded the truck, grabbed the double hot sticks, and drove out in a line of trucks like we always do, lights turning the rain into streaks along the road. The odd things began before we even got set up. The radio in my rig started cutting in and out with this thin, high static that none of us could tune away. Marco, my ground man, said it sounded like interference from a passing storm cell and shrugged. He's older and less wired for fuss. Been on crews since before I was born. So when he shrugs, I try not to freak. The scanner was busy with weather reports, lightning strikes, and somebody somewhere calling that an automated breaker had tripped. It all sounded normal for a night like that, except for the way the static would climb in frequency every few minutes, and the way the rain, which had been steady on the truck hood, would stop in a perfect circle over the tree line and then come back hard. Like the storm itself had teeth. We set the bucket under pole 47 and raised up. The wind was a living thing by then, gusting and wrenching at the truck, even on the outriggers. You learn to ignore the elements until you don't, and the first 10 feet felt like routine. Seat locked, harness clipped, hot gloves on. The lights on the dash flicked in the rain. The floodlight on the boom cut a cone through the dark. Marco talked through his headset. "Ryan, you good up there?" He was a voice I trusted. I told him I was ready. Up in the bucket is the kind of isolation you don't get anywhere else. You speak to the ground over a throat mic and the world below becomes a model. Trucks, cones, orange vests. Up there you're small and exposed. You feel the line under your hands in a way that's the only thing that keeps you pointed at the work. That night, the line felt wrong. It wasn't sag or tight. It hummed under the gloves, a deep, steady vibration through the towers that I've felt before when the system's healthy, but this was stronger and steady in a way it shouldn't be, with the breaker open. I was finishing the second clamp and thinking quick about the third when my radio went blank. Not static, just nothing. The little green receive light on my handset glowed, but there was no other voice, no dispatcher telling us to hold, no check-in from the crew behind us. For a moment, I thought the headset had popped off. I tugged it back into place and called down, "Marco, can you hear me?" He answered, but the delay from the tower's feeds made his voice thin and far. He said, "Yeah, we got you. Power's still out on this spur." Then there was that thin hiss, and his voice cut. And then the rain stopped. It didn't taper. The drops just stopped midair, and the world was reduced to the sound of the bucket's motor and my own breathing. You think storms are noisy no matter what, but that silence was complete, almost heavy. I could make out the blood bass of the feeder under me, the line's tone, and the tiny squeal of ceramic on post. All the small mechanical noises you never notice until everything else falls away. I looked up out from under my hard hat and saw it move across the cloud deck. It was pale, like the inside of a fog bank lit from within, and it drifted slow and lazy against the black. Not a pinpoint, not a streak. Big, a patch. Enough to eat several constellations if there had been constellations to see through the clouds. It had a shape, a soft oval with edges that kind of trailed like steam blown by a fan. It moved so slow I thought maybe it was a low cloud feature riding the airstream. Then lightning lanced through the bank like a photographic flash, and for an instant I saw the outline. When a cloud lights up, it lights everything in it. That flash was like focus. There was a form inside that lighter patch, and it was wrong. The silhouette had straight edges here and there, corners that shouldn't be in a cumulus, like maybe a wing, but not a wing I recognized. Big, flat-ish sections like the side of a hangar, then a rounder belly. Size-wise, if that shadow was 200 feet across, I wouldn't have been shocked. It didn't look like a plane. It didn't have navigation lights. I could see the cloud itself roll around it as if it was something the cloud was sliding past. The next lightning strike, slower this time because the whole place was charged, illuminated it again, and I could see the edges clearer, the negative space between cloud and shape. It outlined dimensions that didn't make sense for any man-made craft I'd ever seen. The hair on my arms rose. I had the hot stick in my hand and the clamp under my glove, but there's no training for the way your hands go cotton soft when you look up and see scale wrong. The weird little things started stacking up. The metal on the line turned a faint blue under that light, like everything that touched the shape had been painted with a pale wash. My watch ticked but seemed slow. I remember checking it twice and thinking the second hand lingered on a number longer than it should. The comms came back sporadically. Control to County 1 on the scanner reported multiple grid anomalies, and then again gone. Marco's voice came through once, clipped, "You seeing?" And the line petered to white noise right after. No static. The kind of silence that says the air itself isn't taking the message. It hovered above us for what felt like a long time. The bucket creaked. I could see the creek below where the flash reflected off the water like silver coins. There were no birds. Normally, swallows will slice and duck around the tower no matter the weather. That night, there was nothing. Not a single animal noise. Even the flies up there had stopped. And that's when the size of it settled in. It had this presence that seemed to claim the air below. We kept working. You do, because your job is to restore the feed and keep people safe. I tightened the third clamp, triple-checked ground, and prepared to re-energize when the primary came back. The control center was pinging, and then the breaker clicked on in a way I felt through my chest. A low thump through the line and the world hummed to life around me. The hotline hum normalized, the ceramic squeal changed pitch, and the line's vibration went from this odd steady tone to the clean frequency I know. Power was back on the spur. At the exact moment the breaker closed, whatever that pale thing was slipped. The cloud lighting faded, and in the flash the silhouette thinned and then sheared away like someone unrolled a screen. It left no contrail, no sound, nothing. One lightning bolt later, the sky was a complicated, normal thunderhead again. The radio came alive with voices, and the rain returned full tilt as if something had released an inhalation. After the line was stable, I climbed down. On the ground, Marco swore and half laughed. He said his phone had gone dead in his pocket, and he actually thought the weather had fried it. The little LED voltmeter I keep in the toolbox read all normal. Our DVR out at the substation recorded a minute or two of weird static at the same timestamp we'd lost on the scanner, but nothing physical. No aircraft on radar, no debris found, nothing to point to. The men on the other crews said they'd seen odd flashes on the cloud deck from the other side of the county, like flashbulbs popping in slow motion. Dispatch logged the event as a grid anomaly and filed it under weather-related unexplained. Official speak. Speak. They told the paper a formula about lightning and charged pockets, and nobody wanted to hear a lineman tell them that lightning had backlit something that didn't look like a plane. I drove home slow with the truck lights on low, rain spitting at the windshield in that raw way. It was hard to sleep afterward. Not because I felt haunted, but because my head kept making lists. The odd tone in the line before the breaker, the way the noise died, the exact moment the breaker closed and the thing left. I checked the camera on the barn of the closest farm the next morning. The footage shows a storm, a lot of light, and a period where the audio drops out. No silhouette, no object. The timestamps on the feed line up to the grid logs. There's a 9-second window my camera recorded as plain white snow and nothing else. People want answers, but I don't have one. I don't have a story about lights on or secret aircraft or military tests. I have a night where the job took me up above the noise, where the weather did something I've only seen on nature programs, and where a form the size of a hangar moved through a low cloud, quiet as fog. I have the way my hands felt loose in my gloves when it happened, the steady click of the breaker, and the small, stubborn fact that as soon as the grid came back, the sky changed. Every time I drive past Pole 47 now, I find myself unconsciously looking up at the clouds. Mostly, it's just clouds and weather, the kind of sky you talk about with other linemen. Watch that front, it'll burn east. But sometimes, when there's lightning in the distance and a low bank hangs fat and patient on the horizon, my gut tightens and I think about that pale shape and how the world went quiet long enough for me to see it. I was about halfway home when the first weird thing happened. It was late August. The kind of dusk that hangs warm on your shoulders even after the sun drops. I'd taken my usual shortcut through the old rail path that cuts between Baker Street and the housing development. You can shave 10 minutes off if you push your bike through the underpass. Headphones off because my mom says don't be stupid at night, and I like the quiet anyway. The crickets, somebody's radio leaking through a window, the occasional dog bark, normal summer evening stuff. The small oddities started slow. There was a light up ahead at the underpass that usually flickered and buzzed, but tonight it was steady, almost too steady, like someone had replaced a bulb with a new one that didn't belong. I thought about it and kept pedaling. Then, a car went by on the street above, and its radio shrieked with static for about 3 seconds before settling on a song. That was my next weird thing. The song, cut like a record scratch, came back and the driver didn't seem to notice. I called out, "You okay?" But the car was already past. By the time I pushed the bike under the bridge, the air felt different, like someone had wrapped the path in cotton. The usual wind that comes down the hollow was gone. My sneakers scuffed a little more than usual on the gravel. I remember thinking, for no good reason, that the hum of the city was thinner than it should be. I reached the clearing where the path opens to the street and paused to check my phone. No messages, battery fine, and then the dog on the corner started barking, like its throat had disconnected from the rest of the world and decided to scream. It went on and then cut out mid-bark, which is a weird sound to hear if you've never heard it before. Not silence exactly, but an abrupt stop. I pushed my bike into the road there because I hate riding through the subdivision. Folks are messy with their sprinklers and kids. That's when I noticed the sky. The stars were starting to come out, not many yet, just the bright ones, but a patch of the heavens above the north end of town looked off, darker, like someone had pulled a sweater over that bit of sky. I squinted, shading my eyes with my hand, and at the same time a low hum started beneath me. Not in my ears at first, but in my chest, the kind of bass you feel at a concert if you stand too close to the speakers. It was steady and flat, a tone that didn't change pitch. I looked up properly then. I don't know why I did, but there it was, a triangular shadow the size of 3 houses, just above the tree line. It blocked the stars in a clean, straight triangle. No lights, no blinking red beacons you get on planes, just a matte darkness like a cutout placed against the sky. It moved so slow that I thought maybe I was imagining speed. Planes move with engines and stars streak differently. This thing drifted like a page sailing down in slow motion. My first thought was drones. Lots of folks around here mess with drones. But drones make a sound. They hum sharp and close, little frantic rotary notes. This hum was different, long, low, like wind in a pipe, and it didn't come from the thing in the sky so much as from the air between me and it. My throat went dry. I remember that detail because I tried to swallow a few times and felt like the sound swallowed the motion. For a few seconds, I just stood there. The street was empty. The neighbor's porch light swung a little in its chain but didn't flicker. A branch on the maple near the curb hung completely still. Even my bike seemed loud in the silence when I moved the kickstand. Then something else happened that made my stomach take a running leap upward. The humming cut off. Not faded, not a slow dying. It stopped like someone flipped a switch. Everything that had been part of the background snapped back into motion at once. Someone honked 2 blocks over, a kid on a skateboard laughed, a dog started yapping like he remembered how. The triangle was gone. It vanished so cleanly that for a second I thought I'd blinked. One instant there was a heavy dark shape and a pressure that made my ears feel funny. The next, the sky was as it always was at dusk, only with more stars appearing as if someone had suddenly unzipped a velvet curtain. The sense of wrong was still there, though. That odd, tight feeling in my chest you get when your brain knows a rule and something broke it. I pedaled the rest of the way slowly. The streetlights seemed a little dimmer, but steady. I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no weird notifications. The GPS timestamp on the screen matched the clock in my head. I got home, shut the garage door, left the bike in the mudroom. My mom asked how practice was. I said fine, made dinner, tried to act normal. She asked what took me so long, and I told her I'd taken the scenic route because my legs felt like pedaling. She laughed and said okay, and we moved on. I didn't tell her at first. There's always this small voice that says, don't tell, because people will roll their eyes and hand you the standard list. Bad pizza, tired eyes, too many late nights. I told my friend Luis an hour later when I texted him a dumb meme. He was quiet for a bit and then wrote back, "You see that triangle too?" My cousin called from the highway, said the same. That was the first time the memory unbottled for me and didn't taste totally insane. Luis and I met up the next morning at the diner. He'd been out late too, but had been farther north. Said his headlights picked out a dark shape down near the old mill building. Same slow movement. We both tried not to make too much of it. People trade stories. Memory edits itself. But the two of us comparing details made it feel less like a weird dream. He said his truck radio had gone dead for a minute while the thing passed, which fit with the silence I'd heard fall after the humming stopped. That afternoon, I went back with my bike and a flashlight because I wanted to see if there was anything on the lawn, the road, the gutters, some physical trace of what had been overhead. There was nothing. Grass unpressed, tire tracks only from cars. A smear of tar on the curb looked like the usual, not like anything melted or burned. The only odd thing was a thin film of condensation on the inside of my bike helmet, where I'd left it that morning on the porch. I wiped it and thought that was probably sweat from last night, but the way it felt cold made me mention it to Luis later, and he said his dog had been shaking even though it wasn't cold out. Weeks went by and nothing else big happened, though there were smaller strangenesses. A group of streetlights by the community center blinked in a pattern for 6 seconds one night, and nobody could explain why the control box was fine. The highway cameras recorded an odd shadow passing over the overpass, but with no recognizable edges. The footage was fuzzy, in a way the tech people said could be compression. Old Mr. Helper from 3 blocks over swore his barn radio went static at 9:17 p.m. The night I'd seen it, and that his chickens got quiet for a whole minute. I kept riding my bike. You don't stop living because one thing you can't explain brushes your life. But I found myself looking up more, especially when I was near that underpass with the steady light. If I heard a low hum, now it made me tense, fingers tight on the handlebars, waiting for something to cut out or fall apart. The triangle never came back to my part of town, at least not while I was watching. But sometimes I'd catch a flicker on the horizon when the clouds were thin and think I saw a corner of it moving against the stars. People say we live in a world with cameras on every corner, that nothing truly vanishes. That's true enough, but the thing I saw didn't leave a photo, or if it did, the frame collapsed into static. The only evidence I have is my own memory, Luis's, that old farmer's chicken silence. That and the way a normal evening rewired itself for a moment into something else. I told my mom eventually because she noticed I was jumpier, asking if I wanted her to drive me to practice. She listened and then asked if I'd called the sheriff. I said no. What would I say? There was a big dark triangle in the sky and my phone was quiet. She sighed and told me to keep my head down. Her way of saying she worried without making it worse. Night still feels different sometimes. When I'm pedaling down that rail path, I glance up and check the sky. It's probably the same stars as always, but the habit of looking has stuck. If you asked me to explain what I saw, I'd say it was a shape that didn't belong, slower than engines, quieter than wind. I'd say the hum cut out like a curtain closing, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. I don't know what else to say, and I don't have a neat way to finish this off, because there isn't one. I came home that night. I slept. The days kept happening. Sometimes, when the wind dies down and the underpass light is a little too steady, I lock my bike up at the end of the driveway and watch the sky for a while, not expecting anything to return, only knowing I'm looking now in case it does. I was coming back from a late shift at the clinic, driving along County Road 18. It was about 11:40 at night, cool but not cold, and the sky was perfectly clear. Out there, it's all fields and tree lines. No streetlights, no traffic once you're past the feed store. I'd done that drive 100 times, so I wasn't paying much attention. Just me, the hum of the tires, and the faint glow of the dash lights. A little after the turnoff for Miller's Creek, I noticed headlights in my mirror. They were pretty far back at first, 2 steady beams, nothing unusual. It actually made me feel better. There's something about being alone on those roads that can get under your skin. But within a minute or so, the lights caught up, closer than I liked. Like whoever it was didn't feel like backing off. I was in no mood for tailgaters. I kept glancing in the mirror, waiting for them to pass, but they didn't. The lights stayed locked behind me, bright enough that I had to flick the mirror to night mode. That's when I realized something was wrong. The beams weren't hitting the pavement. Usually, you can see the light bouncing off the gravel and catching the dust. But these beams stretched higher, angled upward, like the headlights were pointing straight into the sky. I thought maybe the car had a bad lift kit or busted suspension, but when I looked again, the beams were climbing, stretching past the tree line ahead. I slowed down, half ready to pull over, but the lights didn't slow with me. They didn't pass either. Instead, they kept rising, smooth and steady, like a pair of spotlights lifting into the air. Then they weren't in my rear view anymore. They were above the trees, glowing white and silent. I craned my neck out the window, trying to spot the vehicle, but the road behind me was empty. Nothing. No headlights, no engine noise, no dust cloud, just a clear stretch of gravel fading into darkness. My heart was thumping hard, but not in the way it does when someone cuts you off. It was more like my body knew before I did that I wasn't seeing something normal. The lights drifted higher until they were just points above the tree line, then winked out all at once. The road was dark again, so dark I had to blink a few times to adjust. I kept driving, not fast, just steady, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. When I glanced back at the dashboard clock, it read 11:52. That didn't make sense. I just checked it a couple minutes before, right when I'd seen the lights first rise. It should have been 11:43, maybe 11:44 at most. Somehow, 3 minutes were gone. I drove the rest of the way home without the radio, without even rolling the windows down. Every sound, the rattle of gravel, the hum of the tires seemed too loud, like I was the only thing moving in a world that had stopped. When I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, I sat there a long time staring at the clock. It still said 11:52. I was halfway through the last cold beer when Gus stopped mid-chew and stared up. We had the little patio light on and the sprinkler set to the front lawn, the kind of late summer night that makes your skin feel like it's holding on to the day. My wife was at a friend's and I'd promised myself a quiet hour outside before collapsing into bed. Gus, boxer mutt, ridiculous paws, the only dog I've ever known to snore like a tractor, was stretched on his back next to my chair, legs in the air, the way he always was when he was absolutely content. He froze like someone had hit pause on him. His ears went straight up. I tipped my head and followed his line of sight. Above the maple at the end of the yard, the stars looked wrong. Not brighter, not dimmer. Wrong the way a misplaced note sounds in a familiar song. A handful of them were no longer fixed points. They were sliding, slowly together like leaves drifting on a stream. The cluster moved as one, a tidy group, and it crossed the sky as if it had a route it'd practiced. At first I thought it might be satellites. I've watched those slow chains before. Phone constellations, I think, the neighborhood kids used to call them, but these weren't linear. They kept roughly the same distance between each other, like they were keeping formation, and they moved in a curve that was too smooth to be aircraft at that altitude. The motion wasn't quick. It took maybe 3 minutes for the cluster to drift from the maple over toward the old radio tower to the south. When it stopped, the group sat in a new arrangement, one of those small, dumb rearrangements that makes your eye expect something to match, and it doesn't. Gus didn't budge from his belly. He nosed his head under the porch step and wouldn't come out even when I whistled. That was the first real skin prickle moment. My dog, who will fetch a lawn chair for an audience, refusing his own yard. Before the stars started moving, I had noticed a couple of other small wrong things, and I'm the kind of person who notices small wrong things. The radio in the kitchen that sits on the window shelf and plays oldies all the time had given a single thin burst of static that sounded almost like a voice, and then went quiet as if someone had taken the station away. The digital clock over the stove blinked 11:07, then skipped to 11:10 when I went in to get another beer. I told myself it was a power blip or the cheap clock losing its mind, and I left the porch light on for company. Those are the sensible explanations you reach for in the beginning. The dogs in the neighborhood went from their usual evening barks to a kind of high, single note, and then nothing. I noticed that because across the fence, old Mrs. Fenley's terrier, the one that yaps at our cat, usually keeps tenacious hours, and that night he cut off the same second Gus stared. The sounds snapped off like the world had been muted a notch. The breeze that had been moving the maple leaves died out. The night pressed closer, lighter somehow. The stars shone plain. Then that handful of them glided. I tried to get a photo. I've got a decent phone, newer model, and it usually handles night sky pictures better than I do. My thumb fumbled and my screen filled with a little spinning circle of loading for a beat, and then the camera app closed. I opened it again, and the image I took came out like a smear. More like someone had taken Vaseline to the lens than anything actually captured. Same thing when I pointed Gus's little LED collar at the sky. The collar made a weak halo on the porch wood, but did nothing to the moving points above. The stars didn't respond to light. The cluster paused, and then, without looking like they accelerated, the stones in the sky shifted again and rearranged themselves into a line that wasn't a line, and then a compact shape, not a picture I knew. They settled like someone had set them down with a finger. I felt the urge to stand up and call somebody, because that's what you do when your brain wants proof. But I also felt the opposite urge, to stay perfectly still in the middle of a familiar backyard and watch what your eyes were telling you. My watch, cheap wristwatch, battery a year old, showed 11:14 when the stars began moving, and because I compulsively check it in a night like this, 11:17 when they stopped. I remembered the radio clock skipping earlier, and I told myself the watch was wrong. Later, I checked the microwave, and it said 11:14, and the app on my phone, once it stopped gyrating, agreed. Time felt one of those elastic things for a minute, the way a dream stretches an hour into a second. I didn't black out. I noted the seconds. The stitch was small but visible, like thread that doesn't quite match the rest of the cloth. Neighbors came out, not a lot, just the people who sleep with their windows open or keep their barbecue lights on. A half-dozen heads poked from porches along the street, and we did that shapeless communal thing. We squinted up, said, "You seeing this?" and nodded at each other like we were all seeing the same hallucination and willing it into common sense. Nobody seemed afraid enough to call the police. The sort of wrongness that could be filed under weird but not urgent crept up the street. When the cluster stopped, one of the stars wobbled a little and brightened, and for a second I thought it might be a meteor. It steadied though, and the brightness subsided. The new arrangement looked deliberate, like an arrangement someone had designed to be seen but not explained. I thought about how small we are under the sky and how that fact doesn't change the teeth of the feeling. You can say it's awe, and that's fine and true, but there's something else, a hush that sits over your skin. Gus stayed under the porch. He let me come close and scratch his neck, but when I reached for the leash, he shifted deeper back into shadow and put his big chin on a step and refused. He wuffed softly and wrapped his paws over the top one like he was holding on. I ended up letting the leash drag behind a shoe because I couldn't make him stand. He trembled once and then was still again. He looked at me like he was deciding whether or not to trust his person. I decided to go next door and ask Mrs. Fenley if she'd seen anything. On the walk over there, the streetlights blinked in a pattern, one small blink every 3 seconds, then steady. The light pattern made me think of an old theater sign. She opened her door and let me stand in the porch light, the kind of solid lamp that made everyone's faces too white, and when I asked if she'd seen it, she nodded, slow. "They were moving," she said. "Not like anything I recall. My Harold," she tapped her chest where she keeps his wedding ring in a pocket. "He called it a dance, said not to worry." She paused, like she'd reconsidered something unsaid, and then added, "But Rufus wouldn't go out to pee all night. Wouldn't even look at the yard." Her terrier was, she said, trembling in a corner behind the fern. I told her Gus was on my porch, and she seemed to think that made sense, as if animals were tuned into a channel we barely hear. We went back to our yards. The cluster had rearranged again into a pattern I didn't have words for, like a constellation someone had redrafted for a different sky. My phone on the kitchen counter finally got a text from my sister. "You outside? My feed is wild." And when I opened it, there were a handful of clip messages from other friends saying they'd been watching too. Not everyone had seen them. Not everyone wanted to talk about it. The ones who did used a lot of the same phrasing, like a handful moved together. The dogs went funny. I tried to get more pictures. The second attempt, the camera app behaved like it had something loaded. It didn't want to show me. A buffer loop of black frames and one where a pale smear crossed the image and then the file corrupted. I uploaded the corrupted file to a cloud thing on autopilot and the upload failed. It was small, inconvenient technology failing, but it always feels like proof's the first thing to go when the world flexes. By midnight, the neighbors had drifted back indoors. Lights turned off one by one. Music behind windows started up again. The street resumed its quiet, the air a little cooler than before. Gus stayed under the porch. I brought him a blanket from inside and set it down near his head. He let me lay it and then folded himself deeper into the shadow. I sat for a long time after that, not sure whether I was waiting for anything or hoping nothing else would happen. The cluster eventually dispersed. The stars returned to their regular, gorgeous, stubborn points. The night did what nights always do. It let you think there's continuity again. Gus didn't move until dawn. He did come back into the house when Jenna's alarm went off next morning. She came over after my wife told her I'd seen something strange, and he trotted in like nothing was wrong. He slept nearly all day the way dogs do after a long night. I did what people do in these situations. I told the story in pieces to Mrs. Fenley, to Jenna, to a coworker who raised his eyes and said, "Huh, weird," and then to my wife when she came home that afternoon. We walked the yard at dusk the next night, us all looking up, and nothing repeated. The maple's leaves turned, the streetlights hummed in their usual way, and the sprinklers kept to their schedule. There's no tidy ending. Gus will sleep on the porch sometimes now when the evening smells like rain, but he never stretches fully out under the stars like he used to. He keeps one eye open, and if I glance up at the sky and see a pattern that's just slightly off, one that might be a plane, or might be a group of satellites, or might be nothing, my first instinct is to hunch my shoulders and call him in. The memory of the stars moving stays like a small ache in the back of my throat, easy to ignore until something else nudges it. I make coffee in the mornings, check the clocks, and go to work. Life holds its edges in place. The dog lies under the porch and watches, and that feels like reason enough to look up. I finished charting the last med and pushed my chair back from the workstation because my legs were gone. It was the kind of night where everything felt slow, the third consecutive night shift, and a sky that had been leaking drizzle on and off for hours. My name's Elena. I've been a nurse on nights at St. Mary's for 6 years. The parking lot light by the front entrance hummed like an old refrigerator, and the night clerk was already in his cot in the security office, headphones on, so I grabbed my bag and headed out. Small things were off before I even left the unit. The telemetry monitors had been quiet for hours, usually at least 2 people beeping somewhere, but the boards were oddly blank, like everyone had been discharged at once. The oxygen wall gauges in room 12 cycled in a softer rhythm than usual, and when I checked the clock on the med cart, it had for a good 10 seconds before catching up. I made a joke to Luis at the desk. Ghost shift, huh? And he gave me that tired half smile and said, weird night. He didn't laugh. That's how nights start to pile up. A few things you can shrug off and a couple that don't fit together. On the way out, I passed the chapel door. The light above it was on, even though it's usually off at night. It threw a rectangle of warm yellow over the wet pavement. Someone had left a pair of shoes outside, neat by the step, like a person had walked out barefoot and never come back. I thought about asking security, but the guard's window was dark and empty. The automatic doors sighed and closed behind me, and I walked past the ambulance bay where the crew was finishing a cigarette. Long night? I asked. They shrugged. One of them squinted at the sky and said, storm's weird, then walked away like he didn't want to talk about it. I always park at the far end of staff lot because it's quieter. My car is an old Subaru with a coat of salt and a dent in the rear bumper that I keep promising to fix. As I crossed the row of cars, the lights from the building threw long bars across the asphalt. There was a stray patient information leaflet caught under a windshield wiper, flapping slowly. I stopped to pick it up and fold it, habit more than kindness, when every car alarm in the lot all at once erupted. It was the strangest cacophony I've ever heard. Metallic, thin, like someone had turned on a dozen tiny sirens. They didn't sound angry, not like alarms when someone's trying to break in. They sounded almost coordinated, a single note bouncing between vehicles like a ripple. I had the leaflet in my hands, and I remember my lungs emptying because the noise came on so sudden. People in scrubs looked up from half-sheltered benches. An orderly stepped out from behind the triage doors, and a security camera on the roof of the ER feed wobbled in its mount like a head turning. I froze under the fluorescent spill and watched the lot through the glass of the hospital's east wing. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the windows, as clear as if it were a literal thing in the air, a silver oval was drifting over the building. It was low enough that its underside, whatever underside meant for it, blocked a block of the sodium halo from the parking lot lights. The shape wasn't sharp-edged, more like a slab of metal wrapped in satin. It moved slow, deliberately, and the reflection made it look like it was walking across the sky right above the roofline. Even then, my brain kept offering safe explanations. Balloon, a blimp, a police drone, but the oval didn't have any lights, not the steady red or blinking greens you expect. No strobes, no beam. It made no sound, no thrum or distant wind. The lot alarms kept squealing in that same single pitch, and the world felt like a film running just a hair too fast or too slow. I watched the thing in the glass, and half of me was thinking to pull out my phone. The other half kept me rooted to the spot. My hands felt damp, and I realized I hadn't noticed until then that the coat I had on was soaked through at the shoulders, the drizzle more of a mist now. By the time I found the courage to look up, not at the reflection, at the real sky above the building, there was nothing. Empty clouds, the usual halo of sodium and moonlight. I blinked, and something like a pause in my chest eased. The car alarms cut off at the same breathless instant the oval vanished from the glass. No one clapped, no one cheered. People just stared at the paper in their hands or at the asphalt where spray was beating in little silver menace. A security guard came out then, flashlight tracing and collar up against the mist. His radio clicked and hissed but carried no one else's voice. He looked at me, eyebrows up, and I told him what I had seen, the reflection. He squinted up, then at the patrol car, then back at the night sky, and said, You and me both. As if that meant anything at all. He told me the alarms had all gone off in an exact sequence and then shut off again. And that watch cams picked up the noise, but nothing in the frames but white smear for a second. He hesitated and then added, and the timestamp jumped on the feed, 9 minutes covered in static. He wasn't the kind of guy to make stories. He was the guy who counted cigarettes and kept a tidy desk. I heard the tightness in his voice, and I realized I was carrying the same thing. I pressed my forehead briefly to my steering wheel before getting in. My hands shook enough that they slid across the rim when I started the engine. The heater coughed, then warmed, and outside the windshield, the world went back to ordinary. Wet asphalt, a couple of patients huddled under a bus shelter, a couple of headlights moving away down the access road. I told myself, out loud, that I was tired and on edge. That made sense. That's the kind of sentence you give yourself when you want to believe the regular world is still the regular world. The drive home is normally a half hour of static and nothing, radio turned low, coffee cup cooling in the cup holder. That night, the radio cut out again around the county line for a full 10 miles, just dead air, and then came back like a train pulling into a station. The street signs looked wrong for a few minutes. Anytime I blinked, they seemed to be one word off, or the fonts thicker. My calendar notification dinged and told me it was 3:17 a.m. when my phone had said 3:08 at the hospital. I thought about the security feed timestamp and the guard's static report, and I told myself I was making patterns out of noise. When I pulled into my driveway, the house lights gave me a small domestic comfort. My cat, Miso, met me at the door with an accusation of cold paws and a tail curved like a question mark. I left my wet coat in a heap on the foyer chair and made coffee because it's what I always do, and because the motions of making it, measuring grounds, the metallic scrape, the whir of the kettle, feel like assembling the pieces of a life back into place. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with a mug and the window open a crack and kept watching the sky. I told myself I would go back in the morning and ask someone if they'd seen anything. I thought about calling my sister, but the story sounds thin when you say it out loud. A reflection and alarms and a thing that wasn't there when you turned. People give you a half-sympathetic laugh. You need rest, and that's a polite end to a strange night. At some point between news reports and the kettle's second refilling, I checked my watch again. It was 3 minutes ahead of the phone. I set them both down and left them there, not sure which one to trust. The world had a seam in it somewhere, like a pattern that got knit twice over in a place and made a ridge under your fingers. The coffee grew cold. Miso slept in the curled fist of my palm. Dawn came wrong and kind of soft, pink in the east through the clouds. I drove back to work at 7 because I always do, and the lot looked ordinary in daytime. Damp, quiet, the cars parked where they always were. The security guard from the night shift had taken a longer break and was back to rolling his wheelbarrow of cones. He greeted me like the world had been stitched back. I said nothing about the timestamp. I keep replaying the image that stopped me that night. The silver oval in the hospital windows, so clear and present in the glass, like something someone had decided to project because the night needed a center of attention. The sensible parts of me make lists. Reflections, refractions, a billboard light, my mind running off shift work. Those explanations sit in the mind like shoeboxes for receipts. But the rest of it, how every car in the lot shouted together and how everything settled the exact moment whatever it was left the roofline, doesn't quite fit into a box. I went home that morning and did laundry, and later that day, I checked the security footage at the nurse's station out of habit, because we all do that now when something odd happens. The clip around 3:08 shows the lot, an empty rectangle of rain-slick asphalt, a smear of white where something clipped the camera for a fraction of a second, then silence. No shape, no craft. The timestamps are smudged for 9 minutes like ink left out in the rain. The footage doesn't answer anything. It kind of refuses to be useful. If you ask me what I think it was, I'd tell you I don't know. I know I walked past the chapel. I know the shoes were still there, dry now in the morning sun. I know the alarms went off, and the whole parking lot made a single metallic noise and then stopped. I know the reflection in the glass showed something silver drifting above the roof, and when I turned around, the sky didn't have it. I know I drove home and made coffee and watched the sky until dawn. I am here. I came home. I am writing this between shifts, and I look up when I pass the hospital at night now. I don't expect it to return. I just look because I can, and because sometimes the world hands you a thing that won't fold neatly back into normal, and the only honest thing to do is watch for it.